Ahead and then convene today's city council meeting. This is a special called meeting. It is 1:04. Today is Tuesday, May 11th, 2021. This is being held via video conference. Colleagues, as you recall, the purpose of today's meeting is to discuss issues regarding city operations, response, and future actions. You recall that Councilmember Tovo led on a resolution setting up a process for the council to be able to daylight questions or concerns that we might have. Maybe we get answers, but really I think the priority here was to identify for the manager issues that we wanted to make sure were raised in the after action analysis that he's going to be doing. This process that we're in now is one of what seem like multiple ways for us and the community and the manager to get feedback and answers and to look at what happened during the storm. In addition to this work by council, we know that the council has previously held joint meeting on this. We know that our water committee is taking a look at it. That Austin Energy Committee taking a look at it already has, and we'll have some additional hearings coming forward. We know there's a community task force that's been engaged and has now scheduled meetings and opportunities for the public to be able to directly engage. Obviously, this event in our community was huge and hugely disruptive and very costly on so many levels. Some of those issues are here local. Some of those issues are state and statewide. But I think that everyone recognizes that we need to spend some time to make sure that we learn everything that we can learn and do better in future situations. And I think that's kind of the purpose of this. Manager, I'm going to ask you if you want to say anything to start us off. And, I think it might also be helpful if you would consider creating like a single place on our website somewhere where people can go to about the storm and then tie back to the work that the various groups are doing, so that if they go there, they can access the public meetings or at least be taken to a page that does, so that someone doesn't have to hunt around to try to find the various initiatives. But I appreciate the work that Councilmember Tovo has done, both with that earlier resolution and then with an agenda today that we'll try to follow as best we can as a kind of a general path that was promoted, and certainly look at the questions as a guide, but no one is limited here on the questions that they can ask. We're only limited by time, and we'll try to stay not to exceed the time in any one area to make sure that we can work our way through. And manager, we did not ask the staff to prepare any presentations for us for this by intention, because this wasn't, I would imagine there's going to be all kinds of presentations and reports that come back from you at the end of this process. But for right now, we just wanted to have folks present and colleagues so that everybody wasn't sitting here for a long period of time. I think that we've asked the manager to try and keep the appropriate staff available to us in that time blocked period so that they could be here for that, generally speaking, which is another reason why to try and stay within those blocked areas. It seems as if over the last couple of years, every big event and crisis or challenge we have, which seems to be one that just can't get any bigger, always seems to be preempted by something which seems bigger. But we'll double back now on storm and see if we can stay focused on that. Manager, do you want to say something? And then Kathy, I'll recognize you as well.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. Just really want to appreciate this opportunity to have this discussion. As the Mayor pointed out, this is an ongoing process. This was a historic event that our community, state, and country faced during that time, and it was frankly an emergency on top of emergency on top of a pandemic. And so there were so many layers to this, but the full comprehensive way that we're going to be looking at this, both in the preparation process, what occurred during the response, and then certainly the recovery as well. This will all be factored into the reports and work that we're doing on the after action process that is well underway. And I really look forward to having this conversation today to inform those future steps. But this is really in the spirit of transparency and making sure that we can constantly be evaluating our own work because, as I've said before, we can and must do better when we know the next natural disaster hits. And so this is not going to be it hasn't been the first time, it won't be the only time. And as part of our resilience efforts, this will be critical that we respond to and address some of the concerns that are raised today. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Mayor.
Manager, thank you. Do you think that you'll be able to get staff to create kind of one place for people to go to these various things?
I apologize for not mentioning that. Yes, staff has told me that they are working on that, and we will be able to accommodate that.
Great, thank you. Councilmember Tovo.
Thanks, Mayor. And I wanted to just really start by appreciating my co-sponsors on this item, Mayor Adler, Councilmember Alter, Mayor Pro Tem Harper Madison, and Councilmember Poole. The resolution had different ways to look at this event that happened, and hopefully it will be not duplicative of the other kinds of analyses, but really add to it. I know, as I sat with my staff and talked about and reflected on what happened, we felt a strong desire to really better understand what had happened. And I realized as I was talking with many of you that we were all working so fast and furiously and intensely on our own, on different elements of it that I don't really well know what experiences you all had, and there were whole areas of the staff response that I'm not as familiar with. And so, as we started to have those initial meetings, I know many of us kind of jumped right to some of the recommendations, like we should really be able to do this in the future. One way of approaching that, I thought, was to kind of begin by having this opportunity to ask questions and hear from staff about some of those areas before we kind of move into offering recommendations. And so I really appreciate Jason Alexander on your staff, manager. He has spent a lot of time and effort working with the mayor and working with me on getting these work sessions organized in a way that would be manageable for staff and for us. And so one thing that's changed from the initial plan and the initial resolution we passed, on that Exhibit A, it talked about a community piece where we would invite different members of the community in to talk to the council about their experience in a series of issues. And when we really sat down and looked at the time we had available, 2 half-day sessions just wouldn't allow for that to be done well in a respectful way to those community members. So in conversations with the manager, or with Jason and with the mayor, we have cut that portion of the conversation and are instead encouraging those individuals and those volunteer groups that we know were active in the storm to please go and talk with the task force. So I think we had an opportunity just really briefly last week to talk about the task force. They've met several times, but they've had one hearing. I think it was last week. Councilmember Ellis came in and offered greetings and welcome and some additional information. And then they had a small group of people coming and speaking about their experiences, but they were really very useful, productive testimonies about their experiences during the storm. And so one of the things that my staff is doing is reaching out to some of the groups that we had mentioned in Exhibit A and encouraging them to go to the upcoming task force meetings and share their experiences and their recommendations, their ideas. And our city staff have issued some information about that in the form of a press release today. So just want to call your attention to that. The next public session of the Citizens Task Force is May 14th from 6 to 8, and there's information available on when you need to sign up to participate in that. They are no longer going to organize their meetings by council district. It's now open to anyone who wants to participate in those upcoming sessions, and they've scheduled an additional 4. So please tell anybody you know, and I know we all sometimes we worked with some of the same folks, like Austin Needs Water and the firefighters, and then sometimes we were working with different organizations like BASTA and various others. So to the extent that we can all be getting the word out, I think we will have a fuller and a richer conversation about what all of those different experiences were so that we can learn from them and move forward. And I think that's all I wanted to say. The mayor kind of covered, I posted some of the questions that I had or heard, but really we have promised the staff that we didn't require presentations and things of that sort, that we were just going to be kind of topic driven and jump in and ask some of the questions that we may not have had an opportunity to talk about in the different sessions. As we went through, I tried to eliminate some of the topics that I felt like we had covered in one of the committees. So, and I'll try to do the same for next week too, as we take on Austin Energy and Austin Water. Those are really truncated discussions, given that they've been discussed now in multiple forums, and none of us, I think, want to ask the staff to go over the same ground or to have the same conversations. So thanks again to all of the staff who have worked on this.
That's good. So generally speaking, the outline today is to start with emergency operations. We have Juan Ortiz with us, who is our city lead on the EOC, the Emergencies Operation Command. We'll start there, and then we go to transportation, and then we'll go to public safety, and then wrap it up. Kathy, one last time, I'm going to go to you first, in case you want to ask the first questions as we're starting it off here with respect to the emergency operations. And Juan, thank you for being with us today.
Yeah, I don't need to, Mayor, if someone else has a burning question they want to jump into. I have lots, as you saw.
Anybody want to start? I think Alice. Okay.
Well, again, thank you, Kathy, Topo, for bringing this resolution. I was proud to co-sponsor it. I think it's a really important set of conversations, and I'm looking forward to learning a lot today. I went back and looked at the emergency plan. I forget the exact name for it. And it calls for council emergency training, which I know that I've never had or never been offered. And I think it would have been helpful in the aftermath of this. It would have been helpful in the aftermath of the pandemic. So I would like to understand why that has not happened and what the plan is moving forward to make sure that we do have that training. Council did a lot of really, really important work during the storm. I want to acknowledge that, but I think there were also some things that each of us did at various times that made more work rather than less work. And I think some of that came from a lack of clarity about our roles and who we were supposed to be talking to and how to get things done. And I realized this was not the disaster per se that we had planned for. But I think we need that training, and we need to have that clarity, and it needs to be updated and shared with new council members. And it needs to build in the learning that we have from this experience. So I don't know if that's for the city manager or for Mr. Ortiz.
Yeah, I'll start out, council member, because I really appreciate that question and comments, and could not agree more that this type of ongoing dialogue and training, even as part of the orientation process for new council members, is critical. And so whether it was for various reasons on availability of the trainers themselves, availability of time to schedule this, I'm sure there are multiple reasons why it has not happened, but I am very committed to ensuring that we find times in this calendar year to make sure that that happens going forward. So really knowing that this is something that in my past experience in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, we did have both half-day sessions and longer sessions with partners from FEMA, from our emergency operation leadership, to talk about ways in which not only the operations at the city level are coordinated, but then the different roles and responsibilities that each of you play in this response. So I look forward to scheduling those. I have committed to each of you and many of you individually in one-on-one conversations that this needs to happen sooner than later. And we've already started working on ways that we can get that on the calendar, hopefully still yet this summer. Did I miss anything, Juan?
Spencer, no, I think we've done some orientations, but we obviously need to do more, and we will. I'm writing myself a note here to work and setting appointments with the different council members to make sure that we very quickly do a briefing, and then we're working actually as part of a SD 23 on a elected official training component, and we should have that completed here this fall.
Councilor Foot, are you on this topic? Same question?
On Emergency Operations Center?
No, on council training.
No, I'm different question.
Okay, let's stay here for just a second, see if other people have thoughts on this. It's an interesting thing in terms of training of council members, because I think that this event showed us that the training that's necessary goes beyond the vision or mission that is contained in our emergency plans. If it's just a briefing on the emergency plans, I'm not sure that gets to the questions of really what is the role of the council offices in an emergency, which is not addressed really well in those plans, as people in the community interacting with the city know their council offices. So that's oftentimes the first place that they go. And I know that the council members trying to do right by their districts want to be able to immediately get involved and to address. So part of the training, I think, may very well involve thinking through what's currently not there that needs to be, so that it expands and evolves. Training on just what it is that's written in a document doesn't get us there. There's another element that really has to be explored in terms of what is the role of council. How do the council members get information? How do they convey that? How do they make their district needs known? And what is that constructive interaction as a part and parcel of our emergency response, which is an aspect that we have not built out the best as I can.
Appreciate you adding to that, Mayor, because I do agree with that as well. And knowing both the individual interests of specific council members and how that may evolve over time, and the specific situations that different communities encounter. So hearing how different jurisdictions have talked about those roles and responsibilities, how they have adapted to different individuals and makeups of council, and then the specific events. But I think those are all critical scenarios to work through as we would go through. And I agree, it's not less training, but tabletop exercises, if you will, as part of this process. So we will make note of that and make sure that's included in the curriculum.
Okay. Paige, McKinsey, Ann, and then Greg.
Got quite a few hands here on this one. I hope that is going to be a feedback loop, because I know that each district is different. I can speak specifically about mine, in that it was not widely known that being the first off line with water meant that you were going to be the last to come back on. Some of our roads were not being cleared. They stopped at a certain, midway through the district, and the people at the far southern end were still having to drive on snow and ice long after others were able to drive on safer roads. I also only have one public facility, the library in my district. It wasn't open. We couldn't reach the warming centers. So I hope that is an exercise that we go through together. And it's not just about the hindsight of the winter storm. It's about the foresight of potential for wildfire risk, that we'll need to know how to educate, the people in our district about how to keep themselves and their families safe. But part of my contributing to the task force session that happened a week or two ago, sorry that time flies, was that they had thought about taking feedback from specific districts on certain dates. And some of my constituents reached out and said, I didn't sign up in time and I have something to share and I still hope we get an opportunity to do that. So I did step in and share the district date story in that specific circumstance, but I'm very appreciative that there's other opportunities for my district to provide that input. But as far as, training council offices on emergency response, I hope there can also be a level of taking our input and understanding the different scenarios that each of our districts are going to have in a situation like this, and to be able to incorporate that into the training process or a report or what it is we're supposed to know. And to make sure that that's flexible as we go through redistricting, that we're going to update that plan when new districts are drawn and we have new boundaries to assess. So I do hope that is a feedback loop.
Yeah, McKinsey.
Thank you. And I have been on both sides of this now. I've been both a council member and I've worked in emergency management. And so I have a unique lens that I'm able to view this through. And I really do think that there were some barriers to access of information. I know that I had requested situation reports throughout the winter storm, and it took a little while to get those. So I sought them out a different way, but there are gaps in information flow that would have been incredibly helpful for many of our council offices, and even just a point of contact to know who and where to send information about what's happening in our district could have been completely helped, and it would have gone faster if we'd known the way that information would flow. So I appreciate that we may have the opportunity to go through a tabletop exercise. I think that would be a great outcome and experience for my fellow council members to really see how the process works and to learn more about it in detail so that we can be more effective in our communications to our communities moving forward. Thank you.
Okay, I think it was Ann and then Greg.
Yeah, I would just like to echo what others have said. I really, although training would be helpful, I don't really think that's what we're talking about here. I think we need to have a group conversation together about what the role of the council is. So that might be in addition to training. I have been, I'm just concerned that the council is not included in the process for emergency response. And so we all run around, talking with each other some to learn from each other what we can do to help our constituents. We talk with staff, and staff is wonderfully responsive in a lot of ways, but it's incredibly inefficient. I think that what I would like to have is an opportunity for us together to talk about what the role of council is. And I would like to see our emergency plan revised, if need be, to address that role. And I'll just tell you what I think our role should be. Communication should be clear and open and transparent, and we should be part of receiving that information, not through special meetings or separate emails, but part of receiving incident reports and other kinds of reports. We should be in the flow, in the regular flow. I think that's important. I think that also I would like to see written into the response plan the community engagement portion, and that may not be the right word for it. The community connection, I'll just use that for lack of a better word. In other words, who is it on incident response that handles volunteer activities? Who is it in incident response that works with the council members? We just need a much more coordinated way to do that. And so I would like to see that written and circulated so that we can comment on it and then have a conversation about it. I don't want to go through another emergency that we haven't figured out how the council is engaged in that activity in a formal way as part of the process. It's really felt like we're just sort of an add-on while we're trying to be helpful in every way that we can. And so I just really think that's important. I also think that our response systems, well, COVID is an example of a different kind of response than the winter storm. COVID's a much longer emergency than the winter storm was, but even the winter storm is not like a hurricane coming through or a tornado coming through. So when you have ongoing multiple responses to it, it requires a different kind of level of engagement with the council. So, City Manager, can I ask that? Can we have a revision to the emergency response plan that is shared with the council members so that we can review it and give our feedback, and then all come together with some kind of consensus on what that should look like?
Well, thank you, Councilmember, and I couldn't agree more that just having that ongoing dialogue around what those different roles and responsibilities are, and they need to be part and parcel of the discussion that we would have both in reviewing the current plan that has been discussed, and we can certainly make sure that that's available. It should be on our website, but I'll make sure that you have links to it, and knowing that this is a evolving process and that we learn from these events, and that's why we do these after action reports. And if there are ways that we can make our response more efficient and effective, we want to be exploring that and coming to an agreement about how to move forward. So absolutely, we will be looking at that as part of our next steps from this conversation.
Okay, so as part of the after action report, we'll have a section on the role of council, and we'll have a section on revising our plans to include that role. And then we'll have feedback from the council on what we arrive at. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yes, and it sounds like staff is agreeing with that, and so I'll make sure if there's any changes to that, we'll let you know, but that can be part of our report.
Thank you.
Councilmember Kassar, then Tovo, then Alton.
Are y'all able to hear me, or am I still having the same problem as earlier?
We can hear you. Speak up, though.
Thank you. I want to pick up the thread where Councilmember Kitchen just left off, because I do think that just a training on how this has been in the past isn't as much of interest to me as us learning from this to reconfigure what the role of council members should be, especially in a district system like the one we have now. A lot of those days were a blur, but I do remember conversations with multiple of my colleagues here on the dais where the words would be said pretty repeatedly, am I the one that's supposed to be doing this? Or should I just do this, or do I wait to see if the staff will do it? Or you know what? At this point, I'm just going to go ahead and do this. Those were pretty repeated words. And I think that having a plan and a reconfigured set of expectations about what it is that we are supposed to do, what it is that staff really will have covered, and then what the decision-making process is going to be when something isn't covered, and whether a council member is just going to go ahead and organize volunteers and communities to do it, or whether or not, how to make that choice, I think could be really helpful, because I just think that there were so many different times where there was uncertainty, and it was unclear whether that uncertainty meant the council members should just go ahead and fill that void because that's the right thing to do, or whether or not we can have improved systems where that void doesn't exist, or a council member should wait because staff will fill that void. And I'm not being too specific on those voids because I think there were so many of them, and they were so varied from district to district and council member to council member. But it's just a phrase that sticks out in my mind that I heard from so many members of the dais during that crisis. And maybe part of the preparation is just to tell us there's going to be certain voids and then you just fill them. But I think we just should go back and through some of these sessions, but also through our after action time, to identify some examples of what those voids were, and then reconfigure the training and the protocol so that next time we know, you know what, just go ahead and ship the water to that school and don't check in with the staff because they're busy, and that fits into category C where you just go ahead and do it. versus, you know what, if you have somebody calling with 318 wheelers of water, they should always go to X person. But those sorts of questions, I feel like, were just asked hundreds of times around, do I just go ahead and do this? Or do I check in with the staff and they're very busy? And am I ever going to get an answer? And I think we just need to learn from those gaps so that we can fit in a more efficient way and be a little more sure-footed about the decisions each council member makes.
I appreciate that, council member, and certainly highlighting and identifying some of those themes that did get brought up during this event, but knowing how unique it was and how each event is going to have its unique circumstances, whether it's impacting certain parts of our jurisdiction, our city, if it's impacting different types of individuals or natural resources. I mean, there's so many things that are specific to every event that we encounter. So how to extrapolate some of those themes that we can really take to the next process and really bake into our future responses. But we will always be learning from what happened here and in other events, but knowing that, as you pointed out, so much of this is very unique to what we saw during this event.
My last thought here, that it was a very unique event, and I'm sure each other event will be unique. Part of what was challenging was to identify which things were a void because it's a unique event, and so we should just take it as such, and which things we really should have had a plan for. So I think it could be really helpful for us to say, look, in these types of events, these sorts of things will happen, but then there are going to be these unique circumstances where you are going to feel uncertainty and you should lean into that and work with that. I felt like there were many conversations where we could not identify whether the gap was related to how unique the event was or the gap was due to a failure in planning. And I don't think that is not unique, right? What is not unique is that there will be some things we can plan for and some things we can't. And we need that written down, I think, so that we are not feeling like we're making this up from scratch as council members every time that there's a disaster that has some parts we can expect and some parts that we can't.
Understood. Thank you, Brad.
Kathy,
Yeah, thank you. Thanks all of you, and thanks Councilmember Kassar for really nailing what the experience so many of us had. I think at one point you said you were asking yourself whether like you were part of the EOC, and I think we all sort of had that experience of feeling at some point. I mean, I did go through disaster training at one point on my time on council, and it was extremely useful. And I went through it not with other elected officials, but with others who were participating in that CTEC training, and found a lot of value in it. It did have, not a huge amount relevant to an elected official's position, but it was pretty clear, within about 2 hours on Monday, we were all stepping, or at least I'll speak for myself, stepping way outside of the role that had been prescribed in that disaster training. And some of that, I think, Councilmember Alter, you nailed it. Some of that was we were probably creating more work for the staff and the kind of calling, and some of it was critical and, potentially definitely critical and definitely necessary, and getting resources to people who might not have had them otherwise. And so thanks, Councilmember Kassar, for really articulating like we need to sort of sort out what is that decision-making apparatus. I would like to just highlight a couple areas that I think are very related that we hopefully will have time to spend time talking about today. One is the communication structure and the kind of incident command structure, and whether, because what I'm hearing from people who were involved in different ways, either in the EOC or in other ways, is that they too were having the same experience that I know I did, which is I didn't know who to call. I didn't know who to forward needs to. I didn't know who was our designated point of contact. And so, and I know from talking with some of you guys that you were having the same experience too, and it's not efficient for us to be calling department directors or others who are involved, engaged, and responding to the emergency to get the information just because we don't know to whom we should call. Councilmember Kelly mentioned the situation reports. In previous emergencies, we have gotten those, and And I have heard from some people who were involved in the response that they were not getting them either. So I hope we can spend some time just drilling down into the communication and what that was like for others who were involved in the actual response. With regard to training, one of my training questions involved the city staff, and I wondered if one of you could help us understand how many of the city staff have gone through emergency training. I know we've had a fair amount of turnover within our emergency operations and elsewhere, and I have heard, haven't triangulated this information, but I've heard that some who were in the emergency operations were doing a great job, but they were also doing a job that they had never performed before. And so could you speak a little bit to, one, citywide, how much of our staff have gone through emergency training, and then of the staff who were in the EOC, how many of them were performing roles, have been through previous emergencies? And if you could talk about it also, this may be too many questions all at once, but if you could talk about it in terms of the org chart that was distributed, I'd like to spend a little bit of time on this and know whether these were contractors, whether they're city employees, county employees, and again, just some kind of more information while we're on training as it applies to those folks over in the EOC and more citywide.
Thanks, I'll turn it over to Juan in a second, but I know that we'll compile as much as we can. I don't know if we'll have the exact numbers on staff that have been trained so far, but that will be part of our report. And Juan, if you want to expand both on just the types of trainings that we provide our staff, and then also the organizational chart that was put into the backup for that context. Dr. Ortiz.
Yes, Councilmember Tobo, let me start describing the different levels or different types of training. You have training to be able to know how to coordinate in an emergency, and that's what we classify more of the federally required training, the National Incident Management System, and the different levels of independent study courses that need to take, as well as 40-hour courses that need to be completed, and that is a certain level of foundational training that not only our EOC personnel, but different personnel and different city departments that are utilized in disasters and emergencies need to complete this training. This, like the city manager said, we'll get you those numbers later time, but you have that basically core foundational training that needs to happen. In addition to that, in the EOC, we do offer what we call an EOC orientation training. In addition to that, there's several different courses that we specifically offer or coordinate that deal with more of the specific functional approaches and when we set up the Emergency Operations Center. The organizational chart that you saw breaks it up into what we call a operations, planning, finance, and logistics section. And so there's very specific training that needs to happen within those courses. In addition to that, we also coordinate or facilitate training to allow folks to become what's called an incident management team member. And there's a long certification process for that. And also, about a year ago, we made an application to go to a very unique training course where we took 70 members of our community, both between the city and the county, that it also included the city manager, the mayor, and the then county judge, to the National Training Center for the Integrated Emergency Management course, and on which we went through a week-long course training on conducting drills, specifically on the subject of responding to a winter weather event. So those are the kinds of trainings that we look for and we try to offer and coordinate. I would say that individual departments out in the field have probably even a longer list of training that their employees go through and complete, and not to also forget that this event was very unique, and the fact that part of the difficulty that we had was the fact that we have been responding to a pandemic for close to the year at that point in time. And then also when you add the winter weather conditions, it made it extremely difficult for a lot of the personnel that normally would respond to the EOC to get there. And so there might have been other people that had to respond. But even if this was the first time that someone reports to the EOC, we have a process of where we walk them through and orient them very quickly. And we utilize personnel as best as we can, because we know that there's always going to be a constant change in personnel. There always new personnel that get promoted, new job assignments, new personnel that move on, retire. And so we constantly have a series of experience, intermediate experience, and novice people working in any emergency. And so we try to make sure that we have a process or a procedure where we take every help that we can get and point it in the right direction, and make sure that we are able to then follow it up with more specific guidance in their operations.
Thanks, Director Ortiz. I look forward to, and thanks for that overview. And then I look forward to the kind of follow-up about, who among our city staff, if we have those kinds of events as we did this time, where you had people coming to the EOC who may not have had that level of specific training. It would be interesting to know, Manager, too, as you look forward, whether that is going to be integrated, at least a one-day training, integrated into some more of the staff responsibilities. Director Ortiz, could you speak to, so we got the organizational chart, which I appreciate. It's dated 2/25, and so I don't know if you had an opportunity to see my questions that I submitted, but I was wondering if this was the organizational structure that you utilized for the entire storm, or whether this really just is the organizational chart as it was on 2/25. And then if you could give us a sense, there are quite a few positions that aren't noted with a name. And I was wondering, of these, are some of these individuals contractors? Are these all city staff? Are they all county staff? Because it's my understanding there were different people involved in leadership positions within the EOC, some of whom may have been contractors. But I wanted to kind of get your sense of whether that's accurate.
Yes, that organizational chart that you received is part of what we call the incident action plan. So let me take a couple of steps back to kind of explain that process. So we want to make sure that from the EOC, our entire community, both city and county, because again, we are in an integrated emergency operations center with the county. So it's a city-county emergency operations center. We want to make sure that everybody's working out of the same sheet of music. And so we have a process of where we develop an incident action plan that identifies the goals and the objectives, and identifies the different key functions that need to be established and those supporting functions. And that's a leave-in document. So we have what's called an incident operational period. So we developed this incident action plan for a specific period to ensure that we guide everybody involved in the disaster in knowing what's going on, and make sure that we all are going in the same direction. Sometimes that is challenging because the event changes very quickly. And so there's a process of how we will update that. What you saw there was a snapshot in time during the entire event of what an organizational chart will look like. And that will expand and contrast depending on the functional needs of the operation. I will say that at the beginning of the incident, the entire incident action plan was very short, 2 pages, because we were identifying what needed to happen and start establishing that functional approach. And as the event progresses, it will grow. It can become during the pandemic, that incident action plan became a 20-page document, right? And as the event begins to slow down or reduce in size, that incident action plan will then will get smaller. That organizational chart will get smaller, and that's what we use, and we train in that process, what we call the planning key, to ensure that we identify everything that's got to happen. And again, from the EOC, it's we're coordinating with all the different agencies that have a role to play in the disaster, and it's intended to kind of guide everybody in what direction we're moving.
Yeah, I do understand the purpose of the organizational chart and the incident command structure. So with the
And council member,
maybe
I'm sorry, I forgot to cover one part. During this disaster, we utilized city and county personnel, temporary employees, contract employees, and as well as volunteers. We threw everything we could at it to be able to ensure that we were doing the best that we could to respond to the incident. We had a lot of contract employees that were supporting the pandemic, that during that period of time, those pandemic activities stopped. So we shift them from the pandemic response and put them to be able to participate and respond to the winter weather Uri response efforts as we identified holes. But I will tell you that we had a lot of holes that we had to try and cover, and we threw everything we could at it. And so, yes, I would not be surprised that in some of those specific areas, we had a temporary employee, a volunteer, or a contract employee, in addition to city and county, leading those efforts and coordinating with the different agencies that were involved in trying to make the best decisions to help our community during this event.
Okay, before we go to Allison, let me go back to Vanessa because I cut you off earlier. I think we've kind of broadened the topic a little bit. And then after you, we'll go to Allison.
Thank you, Mayor. My question is, speaking of Travis County, one of the questions I had was around the coordination amongst the Austin Disaster Relief Network, Red Cross, the community partners that were involved in our response efforts. So, for example, in District 2, we were able to stand up 3 shelters, one at the Ditmore Rec Center, one at Mendez Middle School, and then the third one that was operated by the county, or was operated by the Travis County Fire Chief at the Del Valley High School. And so what I found, what was interesting to me, understanding at different levels, we got an ADRN representative at one of the shelters. The other shelter was run by city staff, and then the third one was run by Travis County. And so can you walk me through what is that coordination like between assigning different partners in those roles, and how can we better improve upon the communication? Because I know there were times where the Del Valley High School was left off of our communications plans, and so we had to quickly pivot and say, no, this is also part of our joint effort, our joint response between Travis County and the city. And so I think that is one area I want to flag in general that I've seen with response and with the winter storm, is how we can better position our joint efforts and collaboration between the city and the county, because we're both doing a lot of good work and we're supporting each other, but it often doesn't get presented together. So if you can speak a little bit to that as well.
Yes, Councilmember Fuentes. Again, we work very closely with Travis County. We operate a joint emergency operations center at the CTEC location. We do have areas where we have different priorities. And that's why we have that incident action plan to kind of bring us together. It does not mean that sometimes, just because we have it all nice and pretty in the incident action plan, that sometimes certain things get confusing out in the field. But as soon as we find that there's a misalignment, we address it very quickly. Or we try to address it very quickly, depending on the circumstances, and as soon as we become aware. It is not surprising to me that you will have different response agencies running different shelters, because that's exactly what we need. When we have a disaster, when we have a catastrophe, like what we experienced during the February storm, we need all hands on deck. We need everybody to help and coordinate. And so what we do from the EOC is try to make sure that we match them up. As we find out that AISD is going to open up a shelter, or a community center has been identified as a shelter location, we try and make sure that we identify what resources are necessary, who's going to provide them, who's going to get them there, and it's really a partnership, right? Because every shelter was supported by the community, and the community is made up of the city, the county, the volunteer agencies, and the public out there itself. So that's probably the best way that I can describe it. Are there situations where misinformation happens? Yes, it happens. As soon as we become aware of it, we address it. We have a joint information system, and that is run with the cooperation of the city and the county and multiple agencies. And this is a disaster that really tested our ability to stay focused and communicate. And that's why it's important that we do this after action report to identify those areas where we can improve. Well, how can we improve? I think we need to conduct more drills and more exercises because we need to figure out how to continue to collaborate. We don't want people to get to know each other the day of a disaster. That is the worst time to be exchanging business cards. We've got to get people to know each other before that happens.
Yeah, thank you, Director Ortiz. And I couldn't agree more, which is why I'm really looking forward to the work that we're going to do around the community resilience hubs, because it falls right in line in identifying those, not only the physical locations, but also the individuals in the community that will be part of that joint disaster response effort, and really making sure that we have a coordinated system and response effort for the next time, unfortunately. But yes, and so I just wanted to flag that I think this really dovetails really nicely with that effort around our community resilience hubs as well.
Allison.
So we moved on a little bit from the initial conversation, but I did want to close the circle a little bit on that. And Councilmember Tovo, raised part of what I wanted to raise again, which is that we also have to recognize when we as a council did stuff that made it harder to get stuff done for staff. And yes, we have to determine what our policy is, but there are times when getting council involved makes things slower and affects things. And we have to allow for that too, and figure that out. So in my view, it is both, we need the training and we need to have the discussion on the policy so that we are adapting to the new world of district representation. But we need to have the clarity of, this is who we're supposed to start with an emergency, and this is how we get our information, and these are the plans that the city manager is making to address the fact that we need better information flow, and it has to be efficient and timely, and it may have butt up against some quorum rules, and we may have to deal with that in emergency sessions, and we may have to get okays from the county attorney, in advance for that. I want to push back also on this notion that everything was sui generis for this storm. I felt a lot of the same things at the beginning of the storm that I felt at the beginning of the pandemic. And I understand that we didn't have a chance really to learn from what happened at the beginning of the pandemic because we were still in that emergency. But as we transition, I think there were lots of the things about not knowing what our role was, not having adequate information, not really understanding how we could be most helpful, feeling like we had stuff to contribute, but not knowing kind of where to channel that were sort of repetitive from the pandemic initial stages to the beginning of the storm. And then I want to pick up on Paige's comment about wildfire, and that may be a really good tabletop exercise to be part of what, we're talking about as one thing. We don't know with wildfire if it will be the same, like the whole state is on fire type of situation. But I think it'd be a good example. And that kind of leads me to my question, which is one of the things that the pandemic and the storm had in common was that there were both situations where our normal redundancies, which are an integral part of our emergency planning system, failed because it was a statewide or a countrywide situation. And so under normal times when we plan for an emergency that hits a city like a tornado or a hurricane or something like that, we're planning on taking advantage of the beneficence of other cities and the state government to help us. We didn't have that in either situation. And we were not particularly, prepared for the need for water, even after having gone through, the water boil. So we could have had a stockpile of bottled water and learned that lesson from the water boil. And so I'd like to ask, what are we doing to prepare ourselves, in terms of supplies and action plans for when that redundancy is not there? Because clearly with climate change, we need to plan that way.
Thank you, Councilmember. And I couldn't agree more that those two events that you were describing in typical natural disasters, you are relying on your jurisdictional partners and other help from the state and federal resources. But with both the outset of the pandemic and then with the storm, there was a lot that was just dependent on our community and how we were going to respond to it. And so the resiliency and the need for those redundancies became very apparent in ways that we had not seen in as intensely as we did during these two events, but certainly in the manner that they played out over the last 2 years. This will be part of our response, especially looking at what our after action report was from the boil water notice in 2018, and were there things that we did or did not do in preparation for, or as a response to that would prepare us for future events, and if not, why weren't those in place? So that'll be part of our description when we compile that. But I think the other lesson that I learned, and as I was talking to my colleagues across the state, was how do we also educate and inform our entire community so that they can have their own preparedness kits, if you will, within their homes. We've never been through an extended winter event like this in Texas, at least for generations. And so people just hadn't had that on their radar, that they need to be having a emergency prepared kit in their home for these types of situations. So really doubling down on some of those outreach and engagement activities as is well described in the description and resolution on the resilience hubs. I'll see if Director Ortiz wants to add anything to that.
Spencer, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's a partnership, and we need to figure out how to ensure that we all as a community are as prepared as it possibly can be. We don't know what the next disaster is going to be, and there's things that we can do. But even when we take those protective actions and we are as prepared as we possibly can, we don't know what the impact is going to be statewide, nationwide, or even worldwide, right? During this event, very quickly, we were able to secure over 1 million gallons of water. Unfortunately, unlike 2018, where it came from a watering plant in Seguin, Texas, this water came from 49 other states across the country and Mexico. And so that is just to kind of to describe the complexity of the situation on what we had to deal with. And I would say that in my 27-year career in emergency management, I never would have thought that we were going to be dealing with such a magnitude of a disaster and being able to secure water. We need to do a better job, but we need to make sure that we are all realistic of what we can do from a preparedness standpoint and be able to sustain it, because we don't know when this event may happen again. But now that we know that it can happen, we need to do everything we can to prepare.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I do want to just once again call the city manager's attention to our climate emergency declaration. Still waiting for the report back on what has been and what hasn't done, which directly relates to our preparedness. And as we think about the climate challenges and emergencies we're going to be facing, it's likely that we're going to be facing more of these. And there are several things in that resolution that point to direction that was provided that would put us in a better stead. And so I would really like that that update on the status, and just, we are going to, need to be prepared. I think the, other thing we really need to make sure we're doing is that wildfire preparedness and the resilience, which was an integral part of that resolution. And so I just really encourage you to make sure that we are moving forward with those steps so we can be prepared. Thank you.
Thanks, Councilmember. And certainly we'll be, I know that staff is updating that resolution and providing some additional responses for you and the council. But knowing that part of this process is really looking at the scenarios and knowing how unique these different scenarios that we've been under, even when we did have access to water, or when we had a supply of water, getting access to that was a challenge. And so as we saw even with standing up shelters, I mean, we had a shelter that was stood up, then a pipe burst or electricity went out. And so we had to move people from one place to another. And those were circumstances that we hadn't seen before. But this is exactly the type of thing that those resilience efforts that you're describing will help mitigate in the future. So thank you for your leadership on that.
Councilor Renteria, and the Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. My biggest concern during the freeze was that, the message that they were sending out about rolling blackouts, which never did happen here in Austin. And I'm just really was concerned that the bad information was getting out. On Monday night, they said that it should be back on by Tuesday, which didn't. And a lot of people took that message and stayed home with thinking that the energy was going to come back on, and, deciding that they could survive one more day. And we had a whole senior citizens apartment complex, Rebecca Bain, that felt like, they were getting that message also and felt like they could survive another day. And then we had to send emergency vehicles, fire trucks out there to evacuate some of these seniors that live there. So the information was the way it was coming out, it almost felt like Austin Energy really didn't know what they were doing and what they were talking about, because, that was the kind of information that people take it to heart, saying, oh, well, it's just going to be out for a couple hours and then it's going to come back on the way they're rolling it. And it never happened. And then the other bad miscommunication was downtown, is that they left every light on, and there were lights flashing on the hotels and everything else, and people from across 35 looked across the street and could see all those lights, and they weren't getting anything. So there was a lot of planning that I need to make sure that everyone's involved, and when these things do happen, that we cut down on our power usage, just like they told us to do, just leave one lamp on to see if your energy was going to come back on, and then gradually turn on your appliance, but not all of them at one time. So I have gone through a couple of these in my lifetime here in Austin, so I knew where my cutoff valves were, and I went to the grocery store and we stacked up the refrigerator, but we didn't have any energy. So that you had to get something that you could just cook right over the stove. My oven, I couldn't turn it on. So those are the kind of things that we need to communicate with the public so that they're prepared, especially the little important things like where you cut off valve. Because when your pipe busts, you're going to have a lot of damage done if you can't cut your water off. And there's a lot of waste going on that happened because of the pipe busted, and people didn't realize how to cut off their water. So there's a lot of little things that that needs to be put out into the public so that people know exactly how to handle the situations, But the communication was horrible. Thank you, Mayor.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate it. And I think my colleagues really have covered most of my questions. Sort of preliminary questions. I do look forward to us digging into some of the more granular details, but I'll just echo the sentiment around communication. Poor Juan, I I don't even want to know how many times I called you. That would be a really embarrassing transcript to look at because I called you a lot. And I got to the point where, like Councilmember Alter, I believe, said, it wasn't efficient for me to be contacting the Director of Homeland Security Emergency Management to ask questions that it feels like they should have been directed elsewhere. That to say, though, one of the things that I found myself asking people a lot was, hey, do you have a cell phone number for? I don't know what that would look like, how we could offer people some privacy, but still have, an emergencies only phone tree system. That would have been helpful in a lot of instances. Chain of command, I know we covered that briefly, but really just having a clear understanding of who does what and under what circumstances. While I can appreciate the org chart, I think there's still some room to grow with figuring out who to contact under what circumstances. Triggers, that's something I kept saying, like, I can't believe nothing got triggered when X and so happened. So, I'll bring up Mount Carmel, which, by the way, is still not back online. All those folks got evacuated and are still not home. That to say, I brought up, the fact that Texas Gas turning off their gas, the gas for, a 100-unit apartment complex, there's nothing that they have to report. There's nothing that would have triggered for us to know that by the X and so day, their gas has been off already for over a week. I wonder how we can sort of activate some triggers, not just for those like your Austin Energies or your Texas Gas or people that are going to be turning off critical utility. We really need to know. And so, speaking of, it came up during the conversation about Mount Carmel. When there were some assumptions about, us having known that their gas was off and not doing anything. One of the reasons I found that came to pass was that our emergency management folks were out at Mount Carmel a week before I found out that their gas was off, and nobody contacted me. And I don't know, I think the assumption was if the city was here that we knew, but I didn't know. Even though the city was there, nobody reported to me. And I don't know that that's a requirement currently. It just certainly, I don't know if we want to build it in as a requirement so much as a really important courtesy to let the council member for the district where, certain staff is responding, know, hey, this is going on in your district. I don't know what that looks like, but it's certainly something that would have been helpful in so many instances. Something else I wrote down was the procurement process. My office has been contacted here in the last couple of days by a person who responded to one of our calls for food, and they said, yes, I have access to a commercial kitchen and a truck that works great. I can help you guys with food. So they were providing food at our warming stations and a couple other places. And so now that they're going through the procurement process, really reconciling their invoice, they're being told that some of the things that they did, including the time, is not eligible for repayment. And I find that really problematic and would like very much to sort of talk through how we make certain that, because there were folks who volunteered and they knew full well that they came to volunteer. There were folks who were getting paid, they were, on the clock. And then there were a lot of folks who came to us like sort of on an emergency contractor basis. I want to make certain that we don't, that on this side of the emergency, I mean, when we needed them, we said, do whatever needs to be done at all cost. And now on this side of the emergency, that we neglect to compensate them appropriately. I want to make sure that that's not happening. And then one of the very last things I'll say, and I don't know how we as a body address this with a private industry, but there were on multiple occasions I was told by organizations that were trying to help folks get into hotels that they were asked specifically, like qualifiers. One of the qualifiers hotels were asking was, are they homeless? And as a result, many of those hotels said they didn't have a place for people to go under an emergency situation. And I think it was entirely tied to the person experiencing homelessness, which I find problematic also. And I certainly have a list of very specific questions and kind of granular concerns, but those are some of the ones that I jotted down while my colleagues were asking. They're really good questions. And so that's all for now. Thank you, Mayor. And thank you, Juan, for your leadership and your hard work. I know that it was probably the most difficult time of your 28-year career in emergency management, because I talked to you on multiple occasions where you were flying in 100 different directions, and I think at this point you hadn't been home in over a week. So we really appreciate your service and your commitment to your role. I think, in addition to us all just being able to respond to emergencies more appropriately and proactively, I think that will also help you and your staff with the work that y'all do. So I look forward to that, to us being able to ease a little bit of that pain and pressure. And I will echo the sentiment about Jason Alexander Spencer. He was extraordinary. And even when he had every right to be frustrated with me, he never treated me like he was. So I really do appreciate all the staff that showed up and stayed overnight in offices and in trucks. And I mean, it was just, even though we have a lot to discuss, it was extraordinary to see the lengths that people went to just based on their commitment to service. It was extraordinary and beautiful.
Thank you for that. And if I just may echo those last sentiments, I just continued to be impressed with the incredible selflessness that our city staff went through during this event. As you know, they had their own families and their own personal lives that they sacrificed to try to make sure that they were giving everything that they could for our community. And, as you referenced, people spent, days, if not weeks, away from their families, sleeping on floors, trying to just do whatever it took to make sure that we were responding to this unprecedented event in the best way possible. There were so many unknowns. There were so many variables. There were so many things that were thrown at the city and at our community from different directions. And believe you me, that we did everything we could to respond, knowing that we were not perfect. There were things that we could have done better, but we were doing the best with the available resources that we had. But just appreciate you saying those words, Mayor Pro Tem.
Councilmember Kitchen, then Councilmember Kelly.
I'll be short, but I just want to thank the Mayor Pro Tem for that, and you, City Manager, and hope that our staff understands that whenever we're bringing up things that we'd like to see perhaps different or perhaps some improvements, it's no reflection on your efforts. We know we appreciate how much effort everyone put into this effort. So thank you, Mayor Pro Tem, for articulating that.
Councilmember Kelly.
Thank you. It was brought to my attention that Texas Emergency Management actually has training for elected officials related to emergency management. And City Manager, if you could look into G200 and G402, the Texas Public Officials Workshop, and the NIMS overview for executive and senior officials, I think that might be very valuable to bring to council as something to offer so that we could have a higher level of understanding on how this process works. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Togo.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Mayor Pro Tem, for making sure that we pause to really thank the staff for their extraordinary efforts. And Manager, I think, it would be, I assume that you will probably embed that within the report, but it would be useful to know, what some of those, for the community to know as well, what some of those extraordinary efforts were and just how challenging it was and how many people we had sleeping at their units and other things. I know Austin Energy talked a little bit about that in one of their meetings. Mayor, I don't know if it's appropriate to change to a different topic. It's not entirely different. It builds on what several of my colleagues have talked about with regard to communication. I wondered if we could focus a little bit on what the communication structure was like. Several of us have mentioned situation reports. I know in the past, for example, those have been distributed regularly to council. It's, in talking with staff and with some folks who were at EOC in different roles, they also weren't getting situation reports throughout the event. So I wondered, Director Ortiz, if you could just speak a bit to how you organized the communication plan for the event. Was it different from how it was organized in the past? And several of us had said, we didn't know who to contact. I mean, was also on the phone pretty much all week. I mean, Jason Alexander may not have been our designated point of contact, but that's, whose phone I was blowing up all week long, just because didn't have any idea who else to call, except, like my colleagues, when we had a need for warming shelters, I called the ASD facilities person, Matthias. I mean, I just, so how did you communicate, I guess, it's not clear to me whether it was sort of council who didn't have kind of the list of people to contact, or whether that was, I've heard that was true for some other folks too. So Director Ortiz, I want to give you an opportunity to kind of talk about how you organize the communication and who those designated points of contacts are, and how if it was done differently this time in terms of getting those situation reports out to a broad range of people. Kind of why? Was that a factor of just the number of staff you had out and the kind of multiple challenges, or if you could address those issues? And I understand it was a very unusual period.
Yeah, let me, and I see Jessica King is also joined the panel here. This was a little bit unusual in the sense that we were doing it in addition to the response to a pandemic. So some of the normal staff that would be reporting to the EOC, we still needed to maintain as best as we could social distancing requirements. So a lot of our EOC was actually spread out throughout the entire community, I would say even to the entire region. So that introduces a certain level of challenges when information is changing very quickly and we're having to work virtually and in this team environment, or using others video conferencing capabilities. So those are challenges that came up. We have a lot of information that we send out routinely. Like for example, in the current response to the pandemic, there is a situation report that goes out, and as well as a more detailed report that goes out on a weekly basis, and it has in there contact information to us. I think what I'm hearing is we need to kind of highlight how if you have any questions, how you can get a hold of us and ask those questions, or if there's anything else that you like to introduce, and how we can provide you that contact information and highlight where you can find that information. And I've made a note here of how after this call we'll communicate with you and let you know how we have a duty officer that's available 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And when the EOC is activated, we can let you know how to contact us, and how you can find that information at your fingertips, in informations and communications that we're already providing to the council already. This was challenging. I will say that in the early days of the winter storm, part of the challenge was the impact to the infrastructure that knocked out the connectivity to a lot of our staff, and probably even some of you lost power and therefore lost access to internet. We're not in the days where we had copper lines in our home, and we may not, my kids probably don't know what I mean when I say what a copper line is, right? But the point is, we have to figure out a way of making sure that we make information available in a accessible, so that you can contact us if you need to, as well as how to where you can go and get information. Then maybe some of the old systems that we had in place, where we had a hotline that could be made available where people can call in and get information, and maybe a specific line that we can make available for information. Jessica, I'm not sure if there's anything else you want to add to that.
Sure. So this was, I hear us say unique, unprecedented. Historic is probably a word that I really want to lean into, in large part because in all of my years, and granted, I've been with the organization for over 15 years, but I think that there are many people in the organization who've never seen this happen in 30 plus years of their time with the community. This was incredibly different than what we've ever experienced before. So from a communications perspective, please keep in mind that we had the COVID response, as we've stated. And when the COVID response occurred, we activated the Joint Information System. And so we've been operating under a Joint Information System, which is a team of people, communications pros from across the organization. So this is not a brand new team that we hire and bring on board. These are seasoned communications members of the city organization right now. So we utilize existing resources within the departments, pulling them from the departments to have them assist in the response. They were dedicated to the COVID response, and then when this storm hit, we leaned on many of those members to help us. But so many members of our entire organization lost power and lost connectivity. And to be honest with you, it was really hard to find out who had power and who didn't. Many members of my own staff, the CPIO staff, we had to go to our cars and charge our phones so that we could send messaging from and send text messages, as well as engage through Teams, as well as work online and send social posts. So the vast majority of our social posts in many ways was sent from cell phones. We had 3 members on our media relations team. All 3 members did not have power. They were working from their cars, charging their cars, and then sending the text messages or engaging through that process. So I know that many of you also experience connectivity issues right now without a storm situation. How many times have we had problems with just internet access and being able to participate in meetings as a result? Connectivity became a huge issue just in terms of getting knocked off of calls, knocked off of internet access across the board. So the first step for us was to assess who was readily available and who could assist at a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week capacity. Because we had so very limited numbers of staff available, many of us worked in excess of 100 to 120 hours within 1 week's time because we were nonstop trying to get information out. The information was also ever changing. And so as much as we tried to access information, within a couple of minutes it would change because we'd find new information. The shelters, as Manager Cronk expressed, we had one situation where a shelter was stood up and then we were starting to move people and then a pipe would burst or the power would go out. And then we would have to move them again in very harsh, unsafe conditions, hundreds of people in buses that were very limited with limited staffing for those buses. So that information, one of the challenges I think that we could do better in terms of communicating with the public is that reiterating over and over that the information could change. You need to stay connected. Here are different ways to stay connected, and here's how we can communicate with you. So from that gist, we stood up a secondary gist that pulled from staff of all the different departments to help us share and communicate to the public as best we can. And we used our own resources. I was posting on my own neighborhood thread as often as I possibly could. I was sharing information, just texting, and being my own personal ambassador to my residents and letting them know what was going on. And that is something that I think the more and more that we can do as a community to connect ourselves to each other and remember that especially in catastrophic situations like we went through, we have to help each other. It is so important to check on your neighbors, to check on each other, to get water for each other and to support each other through these times, because the reality is the government is in charge of helping us stay as safe as possible. We'll be out on the roads. We've got to get critical infrastructure up and running. And to the degree that we can manage on our own, then we need to do the best we can. So the more that we started communicating about use snow to help manage, to get water, use these different resources, generators help, and people started helping themselves and each other. Things started to improve, or people felt more empowered to address their concerns. So in many ways, we have to start being our own first responders in these difficult times. And one of the key things that we absolutely need to invest in and listen to, because I know our HESM team has tried many times and Now we have people's attention, but Warren Central Texas gaining access to information, reacting when we ask people to react. There is a large storm coming. We gave a week's notice. Multiple communications went out Monday in advance. And not just from HESUM, not just from the city, but also from Austin Energy, from Public Works, from Transportation. Every department expanded their reach to really try and get the community to take those steps. And in many places, many people did and some didn't. So those who weren't able to, we have to help each other. And we also need to equip people to do that. So as we can start to look into those resources, I'm looking forward to the after action report that will allow us to really delve in deep and help build out communications that will support these needs.
And Jessica, if I can add, and you hit on something that is very key. It is a partnership. The communications that we provide is not just from the city or the county, but we also have this partnership with the National Weather Service and all the local broadcasters, both from TV and radio, and as well as social media, because we all play a part in making sure that we share as much information as we possibly can. So as we would find information that was out there that was not correct, our Joint Information System team would reach out and address it and correct it, and because we needed them to send the correct information out to their recipients, and their recipients are members of our community. And it really doesn't matter if they're hearing it directly from us or if hearing from somebody else. What matters is that the information that is getting out is correct.
And one additional thing, Jason Alexander and I were locked at the hip in many ways. He was officially assigned to be your council's point of contact once we were able to establish some consistency in who was available. I'm going to share, and he will probably not share this, but Jason didn't have power either. He lost water as well. And he was able to carefully traverse his way closer to my neighborhood to access the resources that he needed in order to do the work. But we would not have made it through in terms of being able to communicate with you were it not for the fact that we were fortunate. We were very blessed to be able to have the resources that we needed to be able to do our jobs. But a lot of the organization didn't. A lot of our communication staff didn't, and they did the absolute best they could with the information they had to get it out as quickly as they could in a very changing and dynamic situation. And so I just want to say, as the interim director of communications, I applaud all of our communications team because, and I'm trying not to cry, I'm not a big crier, but they worked their tails off. And if it weren't for them, oh my gosh, I just really appreciate everything that they did. So if you're listening out there, thank you guys.
Thank you, Jessica.
Yeah, thank you. Thank
Thank
you for
you.
that really detailed response. I really appreciate it, and thank your team from us.
Colleagues, other things on the Emergency Operation Command while we have Ron Ortiz with us? Allison.
I'm curious what we're learning from other cities at this point, and how we're going about learning those other lessons.
That's a good question. Actually, because of the pandemic, I've had a meeting every 2 weeks with the Texas big 6 large cities, and an effort to ensure that we're coordinated with each other. I will tell you that during this winter storm, we shared a lot of information because everybody was being impacted. And what we're seeing is that this winter storm we would categorize as a low probability, high impact winter scenario. And even though we may be in Texas, in the southern part of the country, and we don't deal with this very often, but when we do, it has a tremendous impact, and everybody is in the same situation. And we need to realize that our normal avenues for resources, what we're all finding out is that we want to help each other out, but our priority is to our communities. And we're not able to help anybody until once we take care of those needs. So you're going to have what you have. And therefore, we need to make sure that we are as prepared as we possibly can be, and really be thinking for solutions outside of the box. So we may have a plan, but don't be surprised that the event is going to force you to come up with solutions outside of the box, and try to share as best as you possibly can what those lessons were. In the beginning of the boil water crisis, I received a phone call from San Antonio asking us for what did we learn in the 2018 experience, and we share that. And why did they want to know that? Because they were about to issue a boil water crisis and be in the same situation that we were finding ourselves just minutes away. And it's having that. Well, I think what we're learning across the state is not only do we need to have a communication line within our community, we need to be having a communications line with all our cities and counties around the state of Texas to ensure that we can work off of each other's experiences. I know that the city manager was having the same experience talking to his peers in other cities, and my counterpart in the county was having the same, talking to other counties and trying to see what information and what impacts we were experiencing, and trying to figure out how we can help each other, or more importantly, learn from those experiences. That's really probably the biggest lesson that we're hearing across the state.
City manager, when you do the after action report, I hope you'll include some comparisons with some other cities and some lessons that maybe they're finding in their reports that we may want to pay attention to. Be particularly interested in understanding better whether they were or were not able to roll the blackouts, and which ones were and which ones weren't. I still do not have straight, what the facts are about what other cities were or were not able to do. And I think it's important for us to have that sort of comparison. I think it's been very helpful to have the comparisons with respect to COVID and our death rates and our infection rates, et cetera. And obviously we're doing really well on that. But I think it's helpful to understand how we fared and figure out if there's some measures to help us understand where there were some things that we maybe handled better than others. I would venture that our private sector, our community folks really did step up, and I'm sure they stepped up all over the state, but I imagine we would find that, in Austin, they really did double duty, and that we can be really proud of that. But there may be other areas, like not having been able to roll the blackouts, that we didn't do so well, which would point to areas of concern.
Agreed, Councilmember, and I'll do that. And certainly, as I'm getting feedback in real time from other jurisdictions across the state, but then what are those, as you described, unique situations that each city was going through, but how can we both compare and then contrast to those experiences of other cities? So thank you for that.
Thank you. And Mayor, I have another question, if I might, or if it's time to switch to someone else, that's fine.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So in looking through the emergency report, if I'm remembering correctly, it's been a while since I did it. It does cite like extreme cold and a winter event as an emergency to prepare for. However, I was struck by the fact that in our climate resilient infrastructure report and some of our other reports, cold weather is not even mentioned as like something that we're preparing for. And I think there's a whole set of issues that go with cold weather not being something that our infrastructure is preparing for in our climate resilience report. And I'm looking into some of those things. But I want to better understand, Mr. Ortiz, you have, say, cold weather as an event to worry about in your emergency plan. But then how does that get sort of propagated for the other departments to plan? Because you seem to identify it as an issue, but it wasn't in these other plans. They list wildfire and drought and flooding and I think there's a fourth one. I don't remember what the fourth one was, that they list as like the key areas, but they don't even touch cold weather, but yet you have that. And so it seems like I kept finding, well, we weren't really prepared for this. So I guess I'd like to know how you're propagating that, or is it just simply like you're preparing cold weather shelters?
And I believe you're talking about the city climate resiliency action plan, correct?
Yes, but there were other plans, like we discovered the Austin Water Emergency Plan didn't have cold weather in it either.
And actually, yes, in our emergency operations plan, and then also in the city's hazard mitigation action plan, when we do our hazard analysis, we do identify winter weather as a something that we plan for, and in the document that where you're citing that it is not located, that's a document, and I'm going to ask Lucia to correct me if I'm wrong, if I say something incorrectly. It looks as the statistical data to determine what and so it identifies the likelihood of that having an impact from a climate resiliency standpoint. I would say that we have been in conversations with Office of Sustainability to look at how we can modify that plan and talk about what I just described moments ago of this low probability, high impact. Even though the data doesn't necessarily show that this is something that happens very frequently, what we're realizing, and it's important to note in this plan, is the fact that it may happen very rarely, but when it does happen, it's not just an impact to the city, it's really a statewide impact. And therefore, we need to make sure that we're planning accordingly. And Lucia, if you're available, I don't know if you can talk a little bit more about that. She may not be.
Yeah. She's on the attendee list, but not moved over yet.
But I will say that that is something that we have identified, and we're working to look at how that can be incorporated. And again, it's really that action plan really needs to be in my opinion. I don't want to speak for the Office of Sustainability. It's really a living document, right? So these are the areas that their data has identified. Based on our experience, I think we need to incorporate the impacts of winter weather, and then also make sure that we're open to look at what other impacts we may suffer from a climate resiliency standpoint.
I'd just like to add on a little bit, if I may. Lucia Athens, Chief Sustainability Officer. The climate models that we have run in the past, we specifically in the past have contracted with Dr. Catherine Hayhoe. She is a climate change expert who has also been involved with the National Climate Assessment, and she used the same methodology to develop climate models for Austin for us some years ago. And at the time we ran those models, extreme heat, flooding, drought, and wildfires were the four climate extreme weather risks that were identified as a part of her research and analysis and models that she ran. Extreme cold and winter events like the Winter Storm Uri never came up as a part of that model. So we are now considering updating the model and working with Dr. Hayhoe again to do an update to look more closely at the potential for extreme cold weather events as a part of our climate change projections.
Thank you. I mean, I appreciate bringing up the data issue, and basically, the models don't predict it, but it happened, and now we're building our infrastructure and making our plans based on assumptions that don't include the cold weather, and we know that this can happen. We just had the experience, and so we do need to pivot and adjust and make sure that we're planning for that. And I understand that Dr. Hayhoe is an expert in this and the models, but it does make me concerned to know that our climate models are that far off of what reality is, recognizing it's a low probability, high impact event. So I just think in the after action report, we really need a plan for how we're addressing that. That's not to take away from the fact that we have these other events like wildfire, which are, and I really want people to understand that this is a high probability, high impact event. And so we really, really need to be prepared. So I don't want our cold weather preparedness to take away from the fact that we need to prepare for these high probability, high impact events, but we do also need to be factoring in that cold piece. But Mr. Ortiz, what I was really, part of what I was trying to understand is, I mean, is it just simply that the model differed, or, how is it that one plan says we have to worry about cold weather and the other ones don't? Is it just simply that one was based on models and the other wasn't, or, and there's subsequent things that happen, you have the climate resilience, you have those models, then Austin Water submits their plan to the government for their emergencies. It doesn't include cold weather, and I don't know where else this happens, but yet yours has cold weather. So can you help me?
Yes, and so, the emergency operations plan takes an all hazards approach, right? And there's specific standards that the state requires us to prepare for, and winter weather is one of them. And in our process of doing our hazard analysis, we do identify winter weather as a potential. We do classify it as a low probability, high impact, and that's why we do have plans that deal with that. And in our past experience, winter weather is something that we have dealt with it, but not to this magnitude. And so we have, because of the planning for winter weather, have come up with others more specific plans, like the cold weather shelter plan that provides overnight shelter during when we experience certain weather conditions that are met, to ensure that everybody has a warm place to sleep. And and prior to this day, for this year, we had already activated it 7 days, 7 other instances. And so winter weather, yes, it is something that we plan for, and it's something that we prepare. The difference in this event, this was an extreme cold weather scenario, that according to the National Weather Service, 6 degrees was that we experienced on one of those days, ties for third place as the coldest recorded time in our area. We would have to go back to 1949, where we experienced -5 degree temperatures. So yes, it can happen. It doesn't happen very frequently, but cold temperature is something that we plan for. The difference here, again, is just the extremeness of the cold weather, and those cascaded impacts is something that we are realizing that we need to make sure that we're more resilient to combat.
Thank you. Before we move off of the Emergency Operations Center, I'd make 3 observations that I think other people have already touched on, but I just want to emphasize them too. And part of it comes from the kind of the unique positioning that the county judge and I have because of statutory obligations and procedures with respect to the role of this office in the statutory scheme for emergency stuff. And the first one is that I think getting the council a lot more involved in emergency training in those programs makes a lot of sense. But I also am not aware of training that's going to actually work with the expanded role that I think council needs to have in these kinds of things. I think part of it is going to be working with the council to create that. But a year ago, in February of 2020, the manager touched on it, or Juan did a moment ago, there was the FEMA training for the Emergency Operation Command. And there were 75 people that went down from Austin, the people who man the desks in the Emergency Operation Command, for an exercise for a week. I think 2 things about that I think are historically notable. The first one is that the challenge that the federal government and FEMA decided to give our EOC was a cold winter storm event. So this was the event that the EOC trained on. And the way that those events work is they set up a kind of a fact pattern and everybody gets thrown in, and then they try to make it more and more extreme. And then people have to then react to an extreme condition. Then they make it even more and more extreme. And then they just really press the limits of reality, and they even make it more extreme for that team to work with. And with every one of those things, they didn't match the extreme nature of the winter event that hit Austin. This is them trying to press the limits. Two real things that really stand out that were not planned for in that extreme scenario was, one, doing it in the middle of a worldwide pandemic, which changed lots of stuff. And the second one is a catastrophic loss of power, which didn't become an element of that, both of which probably in retrospect should have. But I just thought that was interesting. The second thing is that while that group of 75, 85 people, and I don't remember the exact number, were in Virginia planning for that, and in the middle of the exercise that was being ramped up on the winter disaster, we were just beginning to hear about the pandemic. So the EOC actually stood up its first meetings on the pandemic while they were in Virginia on the planning exercise for the winter event. I just think that's interesting and goes to the point of how these things kind of layer on each other. The second thing I'd say, and it goes back to a point that a lot of people have made, is we've got to figure out how it is we deal with the issue and culture of people helping one another. Because every time a community group or a neighborhood or an individual step forward to get something done, I say every time, in hundreds and maybe thousands of incidents I saw, it was incredibly well, it was really important interventions that were being done that saved people. In some instances saved lives, but saved people along so many levels. But there was a feeling while that was happening is that every time that happened, there was a failure of the system. Why is it that somebody needed to step forward to do that? And I don't think that's the right way to look at that. And several people have touched on that. In this kind of disaster, a community has to step forward in order to be able to survive. And when the community does that, that's not evidence of a failure of a system necessarily, although there are thousands of things that we need to learn from and do better. But that does not necessarily mean a failure of the system, just that some challenges are so great that you can't build a system around that, except for building in some kind of open-ended way to recognize that in this level of activity, there's going to be a need for thousands of people to step in. So we need a system to be able to organize that and communicate with that, celebrate that, but recognize going into the event that if we reach to that level, that's part of what a successful system looks like. But we haven't planned for that. We haven't designed around that. And I think that we need to. And then the last thing I would conclude with is I would just want to be, just another person to get in line to remark on what it was that the staff did. And it's not just city staff, although they were incredible. It's county, but it's beyond that. It's so many of the regional people are at these desks of the EOC. They're not present. It's the private partners that are present. It's the desk that the grocery stores took inside that room. It is everybody coming in. It's the Red Cross. It's so many people that are getting conflicting issues from not only what they're seeing on the ground, but what they're hearing nationally in terms of what they can do or not do as people are sorting through that. And I'll tell you that those folks were there literally nonstop. There were a lot of people I'm sure didn't see their family for days. There were a lot of people that volunteered and sent food to the EOC and for people all around the city, which is an incredibly nice thing, but it gets really old after 4 or 5 days, the kind of food that can be delivered. But just everybody in an environment where so many people are scared, in an environment where there are so many people that are not getting what it is that they need, people who are just literally dying on the inside because they're not able to actually get to meet the needs that they see and are trying their best to try and make that happen, is the environment that was operating. And it's hard. And I just want to add my thank you to everybody, public and private and otherwise, and volunteers and people that were out to help this community get through this. That gets us past the 245 points. I would turn us to transportation at this point if people are ready to move on. Councilmember Fuentes, did you have something? No. Councilmember Tovo?
Yeah, this is sort of a bridging thing. It's not really directly to EOC. Manager, I wanted to ask you, so, I had compiled a lot of, obviously we weren't able to address. Some are very straightforward, about who received situation reports, general levels of training, things that are just very routine. And I wonder what might be our way moving forward. And maybe I'll just throw the question out there and we can come back to it at the end in the wrap up that's scheduled. But Mayor, you had initially, when you and I were talking with Jason Alexander, talked about these as being good opportunities to raise issues, to identify issues that we'd like the manager to address in the after action report. So that's one of the things that we're doing. But I wonder if we could also create a process that I think you also suggested, where council members can submit questions after these sessions too, to become part of that. And I think the best way to do that is the system we already have of doing it through the Q&A process. And so what I'd like to suggest is that we set up a Q&A process for this, understanding that at the moment you are deep in the midst of finalizing or continuing to work on the after action report, and some of those questions aren't going to be answered for a bit, and some of them might be answered in those reports. But I do think some of these, I think having a very clear and transparent portal would be of help, where we can submit our questions, see what others have submitted, and then get those answers either in that setting or in the after action report. So that's my request. And the other request I have, and maybe again we can cycle back to that at the end, there's a really good after action report that was done after Hurricane Harvey that I've been glancing over this morning, but I would like to ask that be added as backup material for our next session, since some of that deals with sheltering and recommendations. But it was a large body of recommendations, and Manager, as you're preparing the after action report, I am also interested in knowing how many of those recommendations have been implemented in the years since 2018. So I will add that to my questions when I submit my questions, but just wanted to make that request in backup. And Mayor, thanks for adding those thank yous. I'll just also add our thank yous to our council staff. I know most of my staff also had lost power or water or both, and continued to work through that week. And I know many of my colleagues' staff and some of my council colleagues were in that same situation. So clearly some of these things probably won't repeat again, but they certainly were extraordinary. And I echo I'm very interested in the conversation that we have about how well we can equip ourselves and each other to face that next emergency, whether it's through expanded CERT teams or some of the other ways in which we've done that in the past or that other cities are doing. So some of those questions are things we haven't had an opportunity to touch on, and that's one of the reasons I'm especially eager to have a portal where we can have some of those answers.
Greg.
Mayor, I really appreciate you raising the issue of volunteerism in all of this. And I want to connect it back to part of the conversation we were having earlier about people being unsure what things the government should be doing and what things it's right for them to be stepping into. And so I hope that between here and the next disaster, we're able to tell folks and maybe even use this example to say, these are the things that we knew we could do. These are the things that we wish we could have stepped up and done as a local government. And then here are the things that everyday people did that we needed them to do, and we're going to need you to come back and do again. Here are places you can sign up to do that. We're going to have an organized way to really celebrate and uplift that. Again, because there were lots of instances where folks said, should I organize this water distribution or food distribution, or is that something the city is supposed to do? And what we want for the next disaster is for people to not have that question as much and step into and celebrate and get done what it is they're supposed to do while knowing what it is that we are doing. And so I don't mean to really just repeat what you said, Mayor. I think it is both for emphasis, but also I think a communication thing for folks to know what their role is and where it is that they can go. I mean, I really, really appreciate all of the hard work of all of the staff, but there were people didn't know where to drop off things that they could drop off or where to volunteer, where they could volunteer. And the incredible work being done by some of the existing volunteer networks, they could only manage so many people. And so again, I think that these issues are linked, what you just raised and what we talked about at the beginning of the meeting. And before I close out, of course, my extreme gratitude and thanks, as always, to everybody that worked so hard during all of this.
All right. Juan, thank you. And if next time you communicate to the EOC, express our collective appreciation to that wide-ranging group. Eric Carter as well, who co-led the EOC with you, county employee. Make sure that he receives that special thanks for joining you in leading that effort.
I sure will. Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, council members, for your support. Like it's been said, there's always an opportunity to learn and to improve, and that's what we're here to do, and make sure that we're ready for whatever comes in the future. Thank you.
Okay. So let's spend the next half an hour or so talking about Austin transportation. Manager, if we can move to that topic.
Staff are getting moved over. Certainly we can do a broad overview, but I think the point of this, as you referenced, Mayor and Councilmember Tovo, just we're prepared to answer questions.
To answer questions and just to listen to identified. Kathy, we're following her lead on a lot of this. I don't know if you want to go first.
One of the things I'm really interested in, and I know my constituents and y'all's are interested in, is just the general procedures with regard to street treatments. So Director Spiller, maybe you could talk us through, what were your preparations like before the storm in terms of identifying streets? Did you pre-treat some once the storm hit? Well, I've been told I asked too many questions at once, which is always true. So I'm going to just stop there. But I'm interested in the whole subject of that. And then how did you decide which ones to treat? Why don't we treat more streets? Could we in the future?
Sure. Councilmember, that actually needs to be pitched to Richard Mendoza, our Public Works Director, who can better speak to the pavements. When we get to the recovery, I can certainly add information on which streets we helped Public Works plow first and the extent of those. So, and I think Richard is on.
Good afternoon.
There he is.
Good afternoon, council members. Richard Mendoza, Director of Public Works. Thank you for your question, Council Member Tovo. Yes, pre-event, we have been watching the weather forecast along with all the other emergency response departments. And our preparations actually began at least 2 or 3 days prior to the forecasted first drop of freezing precip. And so those preparations are primarily around implementing our snow and ice response plan. Public Works maintains a snow and ice weather response plan and updates it periodically. And one of the first things that we do is we initiate our department incident command structure. And so we assign an incident commander and then department heads over operations, logistics, finance, all those training components as outlined in the National Incident Management System to ensure that we have roles and responsibilities to fully and successfully implement our response plan. So days ahead, we start preparing our resources that we anticipate we'll need to provide that response in terms of personnel, equipment, and material. For personnel, we place our crews on notice that they will begin for that event. I believe it was on that Saturday morning, requiring to report to rotating 12-hour shifts to provide 24-hour coverage. We also do an inventory working with our fleet department of all of our necessary vehicles that will be required for that response. And for the city of Austin, that's primarily the 16 dump trucks and sand spreaders. Unlike many cities up north, we do not proactively pre-treat our roadways and bridges with a salt or brine solution to prevent the formation of ice or freezing precip. What we do is we apply a aggregate material called dolomite once we observe the first formations of ice particles. And these are typically on our elevated structures like bridges. What that material does is it works with the vehicle traffic to break up the ice and increase traction. So we ensured that those equipments were fully serviced, had plenty of fuel. And then, of course, our material stores, we operate out of 3 primary service locations throughout the city, north, central, and south. And we checked our inventory. Actually, those inventories are checked in advance of the winter season. So we ensure that we have adequate stores before even the first forecasted freezing day occurs. Ensure that material is ready so that when we do anticipate, after watching the forecast closely, those first freezing particles, be it snow or ice, we also have crews that go out on site. They're assigned vehicles, and they go to those locations that we know from experience tend to freeze over first. And at the first signs of that precip, then we mobilize those crews. So our preparations begin days in advance of when we anticipate the first winter weather precipitation. The challenge here is that for this specific weather incident, this is a reactionary mobilization. While we monitor the bridges, we are also responding to calls through the EOC to provide this material to ensure safe access around critical facilities like our fire, EMS, hospitals, ultimately even to our water treatment plants. We responded to a number of calls for that, as well as our own Austin airport. And so our crews were placed on 24-hour shifts, a total of 140 in street and bridge alone, and not only involved in treating slick roadways and bridges and critical infrastructure, but also supporting the other relief efforts, providing treatment ahead of transport for individuals to warming centers, providing delivery of water once we started experiencing the water outages, and then all the other requests that came to Public Works through the Emergency Operations Center. That's just a broad overview of our operations. I will add, working closely with Rob and his team, once we realized that the duration of this event was going to be prolonged, way beyond what we have ever normally experienced recently, that we had to turn a lot of our attention to our critical roadways. And we were supplied a list of high priority arterial routes to ensure that our emergency services could reach our population. And those totaled about 200 miles of roadways. We concentrated efforts midstream on placing treatment as well as clearing those roadways, which we were successful in doing.
Yes, and Richard, this is Rob Spiller with Austin Transportation. I can add some additional detail because I know that was one of the questions. How do we identify roadways? Of course, Richard mentioned that they responded to specific requests, fire stations, airport, hospital facilities, and so forth. But our critical roadway network is our network that we use to prioritize operational decisions within the city. And so it's comprised of our major arterials that are identified by those that have the highest transit ridership and vehicle usage. And so, as you can imagine, it is the larger roadways, the Lamars, the 15th Streets, the Runberg, the Rutherford Drives, the Slaughter and William Cannon, and I can provide you those direct exact lists. But it really spans the entire city, including MLK and Pleasant Valley and Springfield. And so it really is based on the volumes of both transit routes and transit ridership as well as cars, because we know that that's a good indicator of where people are collecting and wanting to travel. And so we use those as our, if you will, makeshift identified routes for plowing, especially during the recovery. We don't have a list of streets that are prioritized specifically for snow removal because it is such a rare event. But obviously, we used something that was similar that we thought made sense. With regards to the signals, we have almost 600 signals in the city, and like many of our residents, we lost power to those signals for multiple days. In terms of preparation, we have been installing battery backups for our signals. We have about half of our signals equipped with battery backups, but those only last between 6 and 8 hours. And so they're really designed to address the high frequency, lower impact events. And so after that initial 6 or 8 hours, we clearly ran out of power and those signals either went dark or into flash for some period of time. I will say, though, that with the other technologies that we have been implementing, more than half of those signals came back up and automatically and back into operation. And we were able to get the rest of that half very quickly based on Richard's plowing of those critical arterials back up and running. Because those bigger arterials were our concern, obviously, because more cars going higher speed is a higher exposure for crash rates and so forth. Our camera system, you may also know that we operate a large number of cameras, and so we were able to use those until we lost power ourselves to communicate about road conditions. Our preference was people not be on the road, quite honestly, because of the infrequency. Our Texas drivers, no matter how many times they get a chance to go skiing, just are not good snow drivers. It just is the fact. And so we were really encouraging people to stay off the road. As we got into the recovery, I actually was making Twitter videos from the road, encouraging people to drive safe if they had to get out in the road, but to otherwise stay at home, preferably. And we did see some hardy bicyclers that were trying to cycle, and we were encouraging cyclists as well as pedestrians. I actually took a pretty hard fall during the event, and so you didn't even have to be in a car. You could be walking across the pavement and lose it. So we were encouraging everyone to try to stay home as long as possible. But that's it.
Thank you. Excuse me, colleagues. Yes, Mayor Pro Tem. And then Councilmember Fuentes.
Thank you. So you'll have to let me know whether or not this is not the appropriate type of transportation. But my question will come back to some questions that I had around our fleet.
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, that's the question more or less. How do we justify preparing our fleet given that, the limited frequency with which we will handle this? Like, how does that work? We just have it in case we have the equipment in case we need it. I guess I'm just trying to figure out what that looks like. And then how do we account for the expense of needing to, make certain that our fleet is prepared for, I watched, you probably did too. I watched, fire trucks and EMS rigs struggle out there. And so just trying to make sure that we don't find ourselves in a position again to where, our hardworking first responders don't have what they need in our fleet.
Council member, I can speak briefly from Public Works perspective. The equipment that we utilize for the response was not, in Public Works, not dedicated snow clearing equipment. It was dump trucks, front end loaders, bobcats, motor graders that had a blade that we typically use for road work. Not the ideal snow fighting equipment like a snow plow, but since we don't utilize them on a very frequent basis, that fleet is not just used during the winter for storms. We use it year round for all of our street work.
Yeah, and this is Rob Spiller. I would certainly support what Richard says, that it's typically more cost effective to have equipment that you use all the time that can be pressed into snow removal when necessary. Because otherwise that equipment often sits around for that rare occasion when you need it, and then you have to deal with equipment that's no longer working because of lack of use or whatever. But that's what I would offer. I don't know if our fleets director is here to talk more specifically about.
Yes, Rob.
Thanks.
So, Councilmember Madison, this is Rick Harlan. I'm sitting in for Jennifer Walls. Hello. I could speak for the fleet-related assets and how to upfit some of these vehicles. I've had fleets that range from the Northeast all the way down to Hawaii.
Mr. Harlan, if you'll offer me just 1 second of grace, I think it was just that 40-mile gust of wind that just knocked something into my window, but I just need to make sure.
Oh, no. Okay. No worries. I guess we've got some weather coming in now as we speak.
Yes, my apologies. Thank you.
Oh, well, no worries. There's always this return on investment and a trade-off, right? We've, again, like everybody has said, we've not had this sort of event happen since the 40s to this extent. Freezing weather is a unique issue for us here. The cold is one thing, but then when you get into the ice, then you start seeing the lack of traction, the road clearing issues. And I concur with Mr. Spiller and Mr. Mendoza. You don't really need that equipment all the time, but there is this trade-off where maybe a select few pieces of equipment that we could retrofit on some of the vehicles, maybe not across all of them, but on some limited basis to try to respond to some of those road conditions. Also, we can look into opportunities to maybe lease some of these upfits in the future, some detachable and reattachable upfits on some of the vehicles to help clear some of the roadway. And then as far as the way some of the vehicles were traveling up and down the road, we have chaining operations that we were trying to put in place. And I know that there was a period of time where it looked like it was going to be a rather dry event, and then the precipitation came down, and then the freeze took place, and then it turned extremely slick. And that was that moment of time where you got chains on your vehicles before that event occurred and then after. So if you delayed in getting the chains put on your vehicles, then you were then put into a position that was dangerous and potentially stranding the vehicle out in the field somewhere. Now, we'll tell you that we did have mobile fleet operations that were out there. We had 7 mobile fleet maintenance crews that were out operating and going around and trying to assist those vehicles and putting chains on for the operations and trying to help them get back on the road. Towing services were in advance of the storm notified to help move those vehicles out of bad situations. where they had to get into wherever they were going to for the emergency, but they may have needed to be pulled out of that. So there were a number of different challenges in that, and it was that timing though that really caught people off guard a little bit, where it was somewhat dry and then it got into the wet, and then of course the freezing takes place. And in Texas, that's the risk we face. We've got a lot of precipitation that comes in off the Gulf that sits over the top of us, but when you got these cold fronts that come in, so you've got the rain first, and then the freeze takes place. We've got to get the timing of getting our chains put on the vehicles in advance, I think, is the biggest part of what we can do to prevent some of this.
I appreciate that, but to my understanding, a lot of the problem was that we didn't have the change. We had a lot of equipment that either failed because, like you said, it hadn't been used in so long, or just was non-existent for stations, for various stations. And that's my general concern. It's not even that, we have equipment that we don't use as frequently as we could. It's like some didn't have it at all, or some had it, but then when they attempted to deploy it, it was broken. So I just want to make sure that we build out systems around maintenance check and, some controls around that equipment. But then I also subsequently do have the question about, and I guess maybe ultimately this will be a budget question, but, for a place like us that doesn't necessarily use this equipment frequently, I can see how it doesn't necessarily justify the expense of really going all out, in one purchase of equipment. But I do think we should have sort of a phased plan for putting together the kind of fleet that can address, like Councilmember Alter, pointed out and has been pointing out to us on multiple occasions, climate reality. I mean, this is our new reality. Our gardening zone has changed, right? Things are changing, everything's changing. And I want to make certain that, we are putting plans into place to be prepared moving forward.
I completely agree. And we'll take that up as an action item for us to look into and try to support that in terms of maintaining and readying those vehicles in advance of winter operations for sure going forward.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And just real quick to make sure I was clear, I would also like to see, I think my colleagues would too, like to see, what our plan, some phased approach to planning for having the appropriate equipment.
Understood.
Thank you.
Councilman Fuentes.
Thank you. My question's around how we communicated about the road conditions. Did we have real-time updates on hazardous roads, and once they had been addressed or tended to, did we give those updates? And if so, what did those updates look like? And if we didn't, is that one of your recommendations, or will this come up in the after action report? Is that we need to invest in that type of technology? I know in my neighborhood, we had neighbors when they would post photos of the road conditions and let us know how it was looking like. And so I think it would be good for us to have some form of coordinated communication and getting that information out there.
Councilmember Fuentes, this is Rob Spiller, and I don't know if Richard wants to add something after this. Through our Mobility Management Center, as well as our presence in the EOC, we were certainly putting out information using Twitter and other mechanisms. Knowing that some people don't have access to Twitter, we use that because the news stations also pick up that information and then rebroadcast and recommunicate that out. Again, this situation with so many people out of power, we thought that was the best way to get that information out. I can't speak specifically about, when a road was ready or safe. We typically were, like I said, continue to recommend people not travel until they on their own reconnaissance decided it was safe in their neighborhood. Many people couldn't get out of their driveways, but the roads were rather safe once you got to the roadway. I will tell you that we are in the process of installing weather stations within our traffic management center, and we have 3 that we're moving to deploy that will talk about roadway or detect roadway surface friction, as well as temperature and precipitation. We've not typically had those because, again, I don't think we've had a lot of cold weather activities. We rely on TxDOT, who has weather stations on their system, to really give us a general understanding of the roadway system, but we're adding our own. And we're looking at ways to partner with private entities to put more weather stations out there. Really, the purpose there is to help decision makers make good decisions on when to cancel school or shut down elements to give better information of what parts of the community are freezing when. And so I think that will help in the future as well. Not in response to the existing storm, but really already as a planned improvement. Richard, do you have anything more to say?
Just quickly, council member, definitely communicating out to the public the status of our mobility infrastructure in terms of their condition, and also more specifically which bridges and thoroughfares Public Works had treated or cleared would be an area for improvement. At this point, we were only reporting numbers to the EOC Joint Information Center in terms of we've treated this many bridges, this many lane miles. I did stand up an internal GIS mapping of depicting those roadways that we plan to clear and add cleared. However, right now, it's just on an internal server. We're looking to that as an improvement going forward. Many cities utilize AVL, vehicle location and GPS services to depict real-time status of the road clearing activities, and that's certainly something that we'll be looking into.
I'd like to make one point there. I think I want to piggyback on what Richard Mendoza was just talking about with the AVL GPS services. I don't know if you all know this or not, but we are installing AVL GPS service on an enterprise level across the entire fleet at this point now. And we've got roughly about 700 of the 7,000 assets already deployed, and are moving to another 2,200 of them in the next month or so. Expect to have the fleet completely deployed with AVL GPS that uses, again, the Google Maps and this kind of predictive road analysis. So you can see live, real-time road clearing and road condition for our own fleet and assets at this point. But I just want to make sure you all were aware of that.
Yeah, it's great to hear. And yeah, I think that's what I'm thinking, is that GIS map would be super helpful for the community to be able to go online and see, where the hot spots are, the hazardous conditions are located, and, if their bridge is safe again to travel. That's the type of information that is helpful for our community. And a comment I'd like to make is that when we designate our community resilience hubs, if we can also ensure that we're flagging the roads around that hub as critical infrastructure, so we ensure that in times of emergency that they are on the priority list to be cleared and treated as well.
Yes, thank you, Councilmember. That's a great idea. Again, Public Works was taking calls directly from those different emergency points and making sure the hospitals and the fire stations were accessible. But clearly, as we move into a more volatile climate situation, we'll need to add those to that sort of critical list. As I said, we repurposed a critical arterial list that we use for everyday operations for the plowing recovery. And so, but that's a very good point. Thanks.
Great.
I think my question will lead back to Councilmember Fuentes' point here in a minute, but I think it would be useful to hear reflections from you all at Fleet and Public Works, or the manager, or whomever else, on the transition from telling folks really to stay at home and to stay off the roads, to when it was that within the city we started thinking that the appropriate communication was to tell people to go get to a friend or family member's house because the water was likely not coming back anytime soon, or the power wasn't coming back anytime soon, and we knew people were starting to leave their ovens on. Can we reflect on that moment? And if I remember right, I think some of the communication on that started happening potentially after it was starting to get dark, when it might be more dangerous for people to get on the roads. So I know there was an internal struggle about when to say that and how to say it, but I think that was a question we were constantly getting, was when do we tell folks it is safe to drive, and how to communicate to people that they could.
Let me provide an answer. Again, I think we were in a quandary to say that the roads were safe because they weren't safe. We were telling people, listen, please, if you don't have to travel, stay where you're at. But if you have to, show extreme caution, because again, it just wasn't the driving surface. As they came to these larger intersections, that's where the risk of a crash is, regardless of the surface conditions. And so we were being very careful to encourage people not to drive, but if they had to be careful. And in fact, we did make that communication, I think, at one point to say, listen, if you've got to make a move, do it before it gets dark, because conditions deteriorate once it gets dark. And so we tried to give the best information without saying that the roads were quote unquote safe. We did it at one point. The recovery said that the roadway systems were generally open, but that drivers should still use caution. So just point of clarification.
Yeah, most certainly. That's going to be a very tricky judgment call. And even the cities up north, they don't clear the entire roadway network. They usually resource only to clear arterials and collectors. But then again, my experience with driving here is that many of our folks are inexperienced. And even a cleared roadway during an ice storm is going to have some winter precip on it. And you know, for those that are not accustomed to driving on that material, it can still be a challenge.
Yes, I just want to say that even when we got to the end of what was thought to be the ice storm on the 19th of February, there were still dangerous spots all over the place underneath the bridges and overpasses that even if you did give that all clear and that the roads were safe, and there were hot spots or spots where you could get into where you would find yourself quickly in trouble. So I think that message of caution and don't go out on the roadways was being echoed across the entire community for a very long period of time and needed to continue even after we thought the roads were actually clear. And it was warming up.
Right. And just a point of clarification, I'm reminded by our very qualified emergency management and communication staff that we were providing that message throughout the whole event from the beginning to the end. I should have said we reemphasized that fact as we went into the recovery or in the emergency situation when people needed to move. Councilman.
And Councilmember, you hit on a challenge that was just extremely impactful for our community, but really where there were no good answers. I mean, these are situations where every individual had to take that level of a risk assessment, if you will. You know, is it more important to get to another place, or what are the conditions that I can be in my own home if I can stay here, even if I don't have heat or water? But the nuances of that is difficult to communicate. And I know our team did an extraordinary job to try to both tell people to stay off the road, but if you need to go to a shelter or access a friend's house, do so during these hours if possible. And so knowing that every situation is different, those were some of the messages that we tried to convey. But I see that Jessica King is on the line too, because I know that the Joint Information System really struggled with how to communicate that and at what points in time. Jessica?
We did. That was a difficult time because in large part there we experienced and heard and even had friends and family who were concerned about their ability to get medication or utilize their medical devices. And so all these challenges combined and working with EOC and our staff, the guidance we provided was if you are able to stay at home, stay at home. If you must, and the decision of must has to be borne by that person who has to make that decision for themselves. But if you must travel, then take these precautions. And then we provided them with guidance on how to prepare themselves for travel, especially knowing that it is highly possible that they could get stuck on the road or on their way to a safe location. So equipping themselves with extra blankets, water if they had it, emergency kits, everything that they needed to do to get to their destination safely was a critical part of our messaging, because in the end, the decision was theirs to make that move. But in many ways, one of the things that we encourage people to do as they made that decision really rested with, please help us protect our staff. please help us protect police officers, firefighters, everybody who would have to respond if an emergency occurred. And then more importantly, just reducing the likelihood of injuries along the way. So that was the emphasis that we had until roads really became very clear and movable.
And the part where I was going to circle back to Councilmember Fuentes' point is that then being able to communicate to people, this is generally what we know about roadway conditions live now, could be helpful, because I think for so many folks, trying to scroll back through a Twitter feed plugged into their car is challenging, and they don't know whether that is still relevant now or not. And then if we don't have some of that information, really clearly telling folks that what we don't know. I do recall that, there was a point where we did start emphasizing to people more what Ms. King laid out about bringing blankets or having food and those things with you. But I think there was a period of time between the beginning and that point where the messages seemed mixed and where people didn't know what the rules were. And so I think that, I think a learning from this is is for us to try to really get that up front with folks, whether that be in the mayor and manager's press conferences or just really clearly laying out to people when it is that we've decided you maybe should go to a friend's if you think that risk is that great. Because I think there was a middle point in time where it was really, we were getting constant communication from people that they were unclear whether we were telling them stay at home no matter what. I think people need some information about what their sense of the relative danger is. And I think I just have to try to give people that information as explicitly as it is, even if it's bad news on all ends.
Vanessa, and then Allison.
Yeah, just have a comment to build off of what Councilmember Casada is saying. I think it's important that we, have these live maps available to provide important information to our community, not only from the conditions of our road, but to our water system, to our electric system. All of those are critical pieces of information. But I also think it's important that our approach should always be meeting the people where they are. And saying that, I mean texting them information of here's a link to find the map, here's the latest information, because, it's a lot to ask a community member to find our Twitter profile or to find that website, to find the map. And so we really have to lean into text messaging as a vital way, a vital tool to get this information out to the community. And we have that, it seems like across various departments, we have that reverse 911 call system that we've been using, or I think we've been using for our vaccines. And so it seems like that needs to be a coordinated tool across multiple departments on how we really lean into that as a method of communication.
Councilmember, if I could speak to that briefly, there is a system that we do utilize, and it's based off right now the Warren Central Texas system. But I think that when we say reverse 911, I think that sometimes there is this expectation that the reverse 911 system hits all cell phones and all landlines. And there is a lot of complexity behind that I have no business trying to explain. But I do know that it is something that we have talked about very frequently, and we are looking towards a long-term solution that will allow us to text message our residents' information and use that more broadly. So that is part of the after action discussion that we have included, at least from a CPIO perspective, and certainly from a comms perspective among all the communication staff. That is something that we would like to look into as well. So we share that concern.
Sounds good. Allison, you want to close out this section?
Sure, it actually might be a bridge to public safety. So Mr. Speller, in a prior forum in the mobility committee, when we talked about the storm aftermath, I asked you about TxDOT and 183, I think it was, in particular, being kept open. And it happened that our district rep for TxDOT was on the line and answered and basically said that they wanted to keep the road open, to keep it clear. At the same time, I know that we had our fire department personnel having to respond again and again to the same spots for accidents over and over again. And there were no mechanisms to try and cut off ramps or to cut off, any mechanisms there that were contributing to those accidents that just kept putting people in danger and putting our firefighters in danger. So I'm curious if you have any additional information to share on that, and or how you plan to have those conversations with TxDOT so that should we be in that situation again, we can take some action that would be useful to protect both people and our firefighters when we don't control those roads, but it can use our resources up in ways that may not be productive.
Sure. During the storm, I made several personal calls to discuss directly with TxDOT district engineer, about sharing services if he needed help or if we needed help back and forth. That's pretty standard. It was a frustrating situation because we were seeing the crashes and trying to communicate that need to on the state roadway. But you're right, I don't have authority on the state freeway system, interstate system. I know our police have some additional authority, and with appropriate notification can certainly close ramps if necessary. So I think that's an area to look at, and I would offer to invite TxDOT to be part of our after action thinking, because it does need to be multi-agency since different agencies operate within our jurisdictions here. So I think that's the way to get at it, is to invite them through the EOC to participate in the after action report.
What kind of communication was happening with AFD and ATD there?
We were communicating through the EOC. I had staff at the EOC full time, and so that's really the place for that communication to occur there. So the specific communication on this, I don't have that information right now, Councilmember, but I could certainly get that for you. But I know that I had staff active in the EOC throughout the storm. In fact, we shouldered some of the responsibility for the entire transportation sort of units because I had staff that could walk to the EOC. And fortunately, were able and trained.
I would like to ask that they be part. I'm sorry, was someone else trying to respond?
Go ahead.
I would just really ask that TxDOT be part of those conversations in the after action, and that you bring in some of those, the battalion or whatever the appropriate term is for the firefighters that were dealing with those crashes again and again, and learning from the experiences that they had during that time, and the efforts that they needed to take to address the challenges that they were experiencing, and seeing, you could keep the road going but close off ramps, and that could be a solution if necessary, but that wasn't an option.
Councilmember, I will certainly reach out to the district engineer working with Juan Ortiz and our assistant city manager, Judy Fidanca, to request that TxDOT participate in that. I think that's a great idea. Thank you.
And I know we also had, with the fire department, we had engines on City Park Road, which is not a city road. And I don't know if it not being a city road had anything to do with how long it took to get those engines unstuck.
I can't speak to the specifics.
Right, but I think that some of these examples need to be, I don't expect you to address these specifics right now. I'm just expressing that I think these need to be looked at in the after action, because there's these cross-jurisdictional issues that are affecting potential responses for our first responders in particular in this case.
Understood.
All right, so we'll move on to the next topic. Before we do, kind of following up on Allison, another historical note. One of the things that were most disruptive for our community about transportation and the inability to use the roads was the fact that while we had grocery stores in our city that sold out on supplies and then had our shelves bare, some of our grocery stores had warehouses that were full of product and they couldn't get the product to us. There was a warehouse that everybody was looking at and repeatedly calling to check on up near Waco. That was the HEB warehouse. And we had TxDOT and DPS ready to escort a armada of 18-wheelers to us with food, but they couldn't get off the site. And they had no tools or equipment that would enable them to have cleared the 18-wheelers so that they could just get off the warehouse site. So I would add that to the list of things that somebody needs to be prepared to do so that we're not missing that stream. But that also points out in this situation like we were dealing with, a lot of what we need in terms of supplies are not here locally, which gets us really part and parcel of what's happening around us. Those kinds of things get exacerbated when you're talking about, for example, in the pandemic, our ability to get food out of other areas is in part dependent on the infectivity level and what those other places can be doing in other cities, regardless of what condition we're in. It's the first time we saw that. Second time was with getting the 18-wheelers off site. So I'd add that to your list of things where you're talking to TxDOT and DPS. All right, so let's move now to the third area, which is the last one we're going to cover today, public safety. And Kathy, I'm going to recognize you to lead us off again. I think that helps orient people to
Sure.
to
Thanks very much. Well, maybe we could start by talking about some of the range of incidents and involvements that public safety was responding to. Councilmember Alter, you raised some of these in your conversation about the fire department and the roads. I think one of the discussions that at least some of us on council or I am less familiar with is the ways in which medically vulnerable individuals had to be transported and how you did that, but also some of the challenges that our public safety folks faced as the storm unfolded. And so maybe we could start with, shall we start first with the fire department and then move on and talk Chief Chacon and EMS? We could go one by one, and you can tell us about some of the ways in which your staff were responding to the emergency and some of the challenges you faced.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this opportunity, council members. Before I begin, let me just start off. It's important that I thank Ms. Walls from Fleet and Mendoza from Public Works and Warren Ortiz Emergency Management and some of our state partners who really provided the service that we needed in the fire department to make a lot of things happen. Over those 9 days period, we responded to over 5,000 calls, whether it be water main break, gas leak, medical calls, fire calls, etc. And some of the challenges we had, besides, in the beginning also that we worked very well with the EOC, the Emergency Operations Center, as well as the Department Operations Center. But the challenge of working with the EOC was trying to get our internal stakeholders to follow the EOC plan, call into the EOC when you need things done, versus trying to work on your own to get things done. So some of the challenges we had in this ice storm was the fuel began to gum up. However, Fleet overcame that. They delivered a different type of fuel to us, was very, very important. We had some staffing challenges. Members couldn't get to work. For those who tried to come to work, who cars got stuck, they ended up walking to work, and civilians in the community gave those firefighters a ride to the nearest fire station to get to work. Some of our firefighters worked anywhere between 48 to 96, if not longer hours. They volunteered to stay on because they knew firefighters couldn't get to work. Some of the firefighters came to work the day before the storm, because they knew if they didn't come to work 24 hours early, they would not be able to get to work. So, the firefighters really came through, provided. We say our mission go beyond our what we actually do. Our name go beyond our mission. For example, when the generator went out at some of the vaccine sites, the firefighters went to pick up the vaccine and relocate the vaccines to areas that had generators, so the vaccine won't spoil. The fire station became warmer station as needed. We became very creative when the water main began to freeze. We used our 5-inch hose line to actually bring the water main above ground to keep water flowing in certain communities. Our apparatus became ambulance. We had to transport patients to the hospital because the ambulance couldn't get up the hill. Even when our snow chain would break, I later learned that we had firefighters going to the local Home Depot buying chains to make their own snow chains for the apparatus so they continue to respond on the calls. This really became unusual for us. The challenge we had dealing with some of the industry. For example, we had a chemical plant or chemical facility that the water line to that plant broke down, and so we had to get water tenders from our partner, smaller department, to bring in water so we can keep the chemical plant system cooled down, so we wouldn't have to evacuate the whole community. The list goes on and on and on. The dialysis clinic that ran out of water, the hospital water line broke. We had to make sure we get water to the hospital, to the dialysis clinic. Our battalion commanders unit put blankets and food and water in their units to make sure the people who experience homelessness will have blankets, have water, have food. We help staff the warming station as needed, respond to several different gas leaks, water line breaking in various industry. I think, if I'm not mistaken, and Chief Wade or Chief Byers can speak on this, some facilities that had water line that broke, we had to remove the water so those businesses not only can stay open, but it would not have a major impact on the phone service. I think it was AT&T, if I'm not mistaken, we had to remove some water from to keep the phone service open. We respond to trees down in the road, trees on the houses. Another big challenge was respond to these fires in the neighborhood with very low water pressure, in some cases no water at all, and then have the firefighters come back to that same location after to make sure that those resident home was boarded up, was safe, covered with tarps, covered with plyboard, to try to minimize all the damages even after the fire, to try to minimize, like I said, the damage to the resident. So, but it was a challenge for us, but we turned as many challenges as we could to opportunities. And I think we worked pretty well with our partners, internal partner and external partner. I'm gonna pause here to allow Chief Byers and Chief Wade to add on in case I missed something. Chief Byers?
Chief Baker did a very good job of covering a lot of the things that were done. There were some major things like Chief Baker discussed about helping with keeping the boilers running for the hospitals, dialysis clinics because folks were several days past needing dialysis to get those up and running again, needing water to make that happen. Our crews also did a lot of other things that a lot of folks don't hear about, as far as making sure, like in individual homes where someone's running low on oxygen, that they were given oxygen bottles to take care of their need, or a regulator because their oxygen was hooked up to something that required power, no longer had power, or left a generator behind for the duration of it so that their oxygen worked for them when everything else was working for them in their environment. Transporting folks to some place where they could be warm, even off duty, doing things voluntarily where they could, working additional shifts because other of their fellow firefighters were unable to get in due to being stuck at home, that the roads were frozen, they weren't able to get in. And the list goes on. Just very phenomenal, the work that they did to take care of all the Austin community, all the people in it, from whether it was minor medical issues to major ones. A lot of situations where there was I think it was the RBJ tower where they ran out of power and they had one room that had heat. So helping to move them off the various floors to the bottom floor where there was heat. And then once that was returned, the power was returned to the building to move them back to their individual residences where they could be more comfortable. Setting up shelters for warming that then turned into full-time shelters, and working through the logistics that come with that. That's not the normal sheltering operation that we experience during hurricanes. And then problem solved along the way, as Chief mentioned about tire chains breaking and finding solutions, either building their own or MacGyvering something along the way to make those work, to continue doing the job that they're called to do. I'll pause here and see if Chief Wade wants to add anything additional to that.
Yeah, as far as the response, I think y'all covered it very well, the various things. I will say, if I can cover real quickly before, we started the preparations days before it was coming, and that was ensuring that we had tire chains. That was talking with the EOC and HESM and the other public safety partners, making sure we all kind of had a plan and we were prepared. We had to bring a number of fire trucks that currently reside outside due to the station construction and get those covered because we knew the weather was coming. So we tried to plan as much as we could for that to take care of the fleet, knowing that we were going to put them into full use, even with what we would call an upstaffing plan. So we put additional 10 apparatus, like our brush truck, our 4x4 units that are code 3 capable, and only put 2 people on it to try to handle the numerous, what we thought the water main breaks or water line breaks usually come with the thaw. That's what we normally see in Austin, is everything freezes. Then when it thaws, we get the water main breaks. We were happy we put the teams together early because we started seeing all the breaks during the middle, early stages of it. So we had a plan in place for that. We set up not only a person at the EOC for all the coordination, we had full-time representation there. We also opened up our department operations center, which included myself and our shift commander 24/7 at the shift commander's office. So we could try to handle the needs and work those either through our operations or push them up to the EOC, such as the numerous fire stations that went down without power, because we were affected as well. The water line breaks. Fleet was incredible at fixing the numerous apparatus as they were going down. And I have to remind y'all, it was so cold that our apparatus, even though they were running constantly, the water was freezing in the pumps and the lines, despite the heat from the large engines. That's how cold it was. And Fleet was incredible of coming out, doing what they could to keep those apparatus running. Councilmember Alter mentioned earlier about the fire truck that was off City Park Road. We had a number of fire trucks that slid off the road. Public Works was doing everything they could to get to it. The roads just were not safe enough to get the large vehicles out there to tow them off the side of the road. So it was unsafe for them to go. But they had a plan, and they knew the moment that they could get to it, because we had worked through the EOC and our partners, there was a plan set in place. So I think working through everybody, working through the EOC, our members and the other agencies did amazing coordination trying to cover all of the challenges thrown at us.
Yeah, thank you, Chief Wade. Again, I want everyone to understand how important it was that Fleet, Public Works, they really came to the fire department aid and rescue through this ice storm, making sure that the fire station generator was working properly as they could, removing those fire trucks that were stuck, making sure we had enough sand or salt in front of the fire station so we could respond. And again, my hat's off to Warren's OTs. I mean, I don't really believe that we understand how blessed we are in Austin to have a emergency operation department within the city. I mean, my hat goes off to Warren. He was putting rabbits out of the hat, and he did a great job. So I'll pause for any questions that anyone may have for us. We'll do our best to answer.
Sorry, colleagues. Mayor Pro Tem, and then Greg.
Thank you for that, Chief. And Chiefs, I do have kind of a question about just recognizing how many calls y'all were making for water mains. I just wonder, by way of best practices nationally, is the deployment of our fire department the most efficient way to handle a big water leak like that? I mean,
It is, ma'am. Think about here in Austin, we have almost 55 stations strategically planned throughout the city. So that enhanced, and we have the tools and equipment on the fire apparatus to turn the water lines off that are busted. I think what would help even more is we had some type of information for the homeowners to learn how to turn off their water to their home. But the large water main person, the best plan of action that's used all over the country is to send the fire department out. Unfortunately, in this case, we were just overwhelmed with the number of water main break. Of course, we can get there quicker than the water department can because we have more apparatus and more stations located. But we can teach these homeowners and give them advance notice on how to turn the water off to come to their home. But yes, the fire department is really one of the best units to use, departments to use.
thank you. I appreciate that. And then my other question is about the situation that y'all had with the fuel. I think you described it as the fuel got gummed up. Just curious, even though they were able to reconcile that challenge, I'm curious to know what we're putting into place so that that doesn't occur again.
I'm gonna let Chief Wade speak on that, but I'm not sure if we need to change the fuel because it doesn't happen as often. But let me let Chief Wade, who have more expertise in the area than I do. Chief Wade, can you answer that question, please?
Yeah, I appreciate it. I should be more clear to say if and when we should find ourselves in another situation similar to this, to where we have a week to prepare. Do we siphon all the fuel out of our, engines and replace it with something? I just want to know if we have that kind of, if we're going to be able to preempt it next time.
So I don't know if we ever want to go to a siphoning, but maybe the bigger discussion and what we have mentioned to fleet is we're currently using biodiesel. And biodiesel is what will gum up at a certain temperature. While we have not seen it, the temperatures this long, doesn't mean that we can't have it for 2 days or 3 days and still run into the same problems, which was extremely challenging. I think what maybe we need to explore as a city, and maybe for the departments that have to respond during the emergency, is biodiesel something that we should be using for the warmer months, and then maybe for a 3 months period when we usually see the cold weather, December, January, February. Maybe is that when it's kind of weird to say clean diesel, but you go to the more traditional diesel and not biodiesel. And that way you don't have to plan for is it going to freeze for 3 days or 4 days? We just know during essentially a 3 month period, possibly we use a clean diesel. I think those are options that we need to have discussions with fleet about that.
And I think if I could elaborate a little bit further, I do believe fleet recognized that on this occasion and did plan ahead, and they did get the regular diesel in place. What the part that wasn't recognized was that the biodiesel that was in the current vehicles hadn't processed through and put ourselves in a situation where the tanks were full of regular diesel. So the intent was there. It was just some lessons learned along the way on a few other components we need to put in place. And I think what Chief Wade spoke to there about maybe looking at an annual plan of rotating the diesel out at a certain point. That way, there's not even an issue at all, and everything can run smoothly through even cold weather without having to make emergent decisions or adjustments along the way.
This is Rick Harlan with Fleet Services, and I agree completely. I think that the lesson learned here, and Councilmember Madison, I think you're 100% correct. We had biodiesel that was in our tanks, and we needed to add a anti-gelling additive to help those vehicles out with the fuel that was already on board in those vehicles. And then with Chief Wade, I think, and with AFD, you guys, that's a great point. I think we just moved to a seasonal change from biodiesel to a number 2 diesel that has a lower clouding or gel point on it. So we believe that those are good moves to make and message received on this end here.
Thank you.
Thank you all. I appreciate that. And then the one last question I'll ask, well, I'll start with a massive compliment. Chief Nix put out a thing that said, hey, union members, a lot of y'all have four-wheel drive vehicles or just are adept at driving. A lot of you come from states that are more acclimated to this kind of weather and driving. And Austin firefighters responded to the call. And I mean, not them in uniform with their apparatus. On their personal time, they still were operating from a position of service and answered the call. I just want to know, moving forward, I guess, let me figure out how to articulate what it is that I'm trying to say here. My thought around that was, is there a way for us to have, not a Rolodex, but like a directory of sorts? Commissioner Trevelyan says it all the time, asset map, an asset map. Like these are the things that we do well. These are the things that we may have in case of an emergency. Because that was just a moment of thinking outside of the box, which helped a lot of people. That said, though, I wonder how we can operationalize it, or that was just a one-time thing. In case of an emergency, we just happen to have that benefit show up for our community.
We do. We have the EOC to have the access to who can get resources as we need it from the state and local level. What Chief Nix did, I commend him for it. But I want to caution us on using off-duty personnel. I don't know if that come a workman comp issue, that come a legal issue, or how that play. Since Chief Nix made the call, it did not hold the city in harm's way. So I'm just cautioning and using, for me as the fire chief or the city official to call in firefighters or anyone to come in off duty. If we call them, they're not off duty. If I call a firefighter to come in, the conversation is not the issue. The issue is can we do it legally, and what responsibility does the city have to those members who are called in? That's why it's so important to go through the EOC so we can document it, so we can make sure we have the right documentation for reimbursement, and we have the right legal box check and workman comp box check and HR box check, et cetera, et cetera.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Chief.
There was somebody behind Natasha. I don't remember who it was though. Colleagues, anybody
I think
else?
it was Greg.
Greg?
It was me, but Mayor Pro Tem handled most of it. I did have one other question, which is, we did have a significant number of people get sick from carbon monoxide poisoning, and ProPublica's data showed that over a third of them were in the Runberg Lane area where you have electric appliances, but people bringing in gas grills and other carbon monoxide powered, other things that emit carbon monoxide to stay warm. And so I wanted to know from the fire department, since we are going out installing smoke alarms and smoke detectors in people's apartments and homes, are we installing ones that also detect carbon monoxide? I know, that many of us on council in 2017 voted to require those carbon monoxide detectors in homes that have gas appliances. But I think we had a lot of people get really sick from who had electric appliances, but they were in these older homes and they brought in grills and the like. So have we taken a look at that, and what can we do to not just to educate people, but frankly to get more carbon monoxide detectors even in places where people use electric appliances?
That's a very good question. I would double check. If I'm not mistaken, we do have the combination carbon monoxide as well, the smoke alarm, but I need to double check before I go on record and say we are doing that. But I believe we are. I'm just not 100% sure. But along with that, as the weather began to change, I think we can start adding those notices like into the water bill or the power bill, letting people know, giving them some public service announcement about carbon monoxide reports. But I think Chief Virus going to add to that. Did you say something, Chief Virus?
It was passed. There was a joint effort with code compliance in the Austin Fire Department. There were a large number of detectors purchased that are not only smoke alarms, but also CO detectors as well. So it's an all-in-one. deal, and those have been what we install. So most certainly we can do that, and we can definitely put messaging out, like Chief said, in the notices from the gas department, electric department, as well as our own social media to let folks know those are available, and we'd be happy to go bring them to them, get them installed.
So to be clear, the ones that we've been installing in folks' homes are fire only, but we now have a shipment of ones that have fire and CO.
That is correct.
And I just think it's an important reminder for us about even in homes where you wouldn't expect you need a CO detector, there are still real risks associated with carbon monoxide. So thank you.
Yes.
Morning, colleagues.
Mayor, can I jump in? It's on the same topic.
Go ahead, Paige.
I had looked that up. I wonder if Greg and I read the same article and we're curious about kind of what the code said about those alarms. I looked at the ones in my apartment, which doesn't have any gas appliances. And even though that same company makes the one that does fire and carbon monoxide, the ones that are in my apartment don't have that. So to that point, if you can assist people with installing them, can you help apartment renters with that? Or would it have to be the landlord that, a homeowner or a landlord of an apartment building that would need to apply for that? Can you tell me how that might work?
For the apartment complex, it would have to be the apartment owner. The fire department, we're going to go into private owned residence, not into apartment location. But that does not mean that we cannot educate the apartment owners on what they should do or make a recommendation for them to do. And we're more than willing to do that.
Completely agree with that. I know it's probably something, since the code is written, and we don't have gas appliances, that it's fine to just have the fire alarm, but it just seems like something that came on everyone's radar during this storm, that I would hope that our apartment renters would have access to the same safety measures as landlords and homeowners that can do that on their own behalf.
Sounds good. Anybody have any questions for the APD, Chief Vaughn? Let's go with Kathy and then the Mayor Pro Tem.
I don't have any specific questions. I was hoping he could do the same kind of overview, but if my colleagues have specific questions, I know we're running short on time, but I guess I would ask Chief Chacon if he could do at least a short overview of the kinds of challenges that your officers faced.
Certainly, Council Member, and thank you, Mayor, Council Members. Joe Chacon, Interim Chief of Police. So I just want to give you, because in the interest of time, a pretty high-level overview of some of the things that we ran into during that week. And we've been working on our after-action reporting since the incident occurred, and are working with HESM and Juan's team to report that out as part of a larger after-action. We were present in the EOC, had participation in there with a commander and someone from our emergency management unit whenever the EOC was open, as well as standing up our own DOC, a Department Operations Center, that helped to, as we had needs within the department that we could fulfill ourselves, or that we passed through the DOC to get to the EOC. So one of the things that Chief Baker really led with, which I think is so important, is the having departments that really are familiar with the incident command structure and the emergency operations centers, and are all kind of doing things the same way, and we don't have people that are duplicating effort. That has been an issue in prior emergencies like this, and the fire department has always kind of led the way and been the experts in doing that because of the way that they work fire scenes. I think we as a police department are getting much better, and I felt like did a really good job in this incident of following the incident command structure. The types of incidents that we were really working, of course, collisions and road closures. So we saw a lot of collisions that were occurring, and we had to manage a lot of those over the phone, having people, because we just didn't have the resources for as many as were coming in to be able to send. So we were working those that had the most serious injuries and helping people over the phone for those that didn't. My hat's off to other city departments that, Road and Bridge and others that pre-staged barricades on roads that we knew were going to have hazardous conditions and are prone to icing, so that when we got those reports, our officers were quickly able to go out there and to be able to block those off.
a very manpower and kind of resource intensive request was security at shelters and water distribution sites. So this was different from what we normally get during cold weather events, which is usually a 12-hour request, 6P to 6A. This was 24 hours round the clock for 8 days. And because of how big and widespread this event was, we had to have many officers that we brought in, as many as we could that were off duty to man those, and then later had to bring in others that were on duty to assist with it as well. And then one of the other important things I feel like we did was providing emergency transportation for those who didn't have it. The normal modes of transportation for public transportation were curtailed because of the road conditions, and we brought in units such as our SWAT team, our highway enforcement units such as motors and others in highway enforcement that were specifically tasked with getting with communications to find out for those who might be stranded somewhere. On the communication side, just talking briefly about CTEC, there were a number of logistical issues, not the least of which was staffing and making sure that we were able to get people to work. And for those that actually got there, many of them had to stay because they couldn't leave because of road conditions. The food situation, we have since worked out a good deal with some of our partners at HEB and so forth that significantly helped us during this incident, as well as having enough fuel and water, both potable water and water to run facilities on hand for a number of days. We were supposed to have a cistern that would last for 6 days. It only lasted for 2. So, we're working through all of those issues. Staffing overall in our department was challenging. Many of our officers could not get on the roadway because of the road conditions. And then others, as I said, we set up cots and just we rented hotel rooms for officers so that they could just be very close to work, and many were working around the clock, including our officers at the airport. Finally, with regard to the vehicles. So it's been mentioned already, fuel availability because of power outages became an issue. Flares and cones became very scarce, and tire chains were a problem for us. So some of our makes and models of vehicles perform better on ice than others. So we are diversifying, working with City Fleet and Jennifer's group to diversify our fleet to help with this in the future. I'll go ahead and stop there and just see if there are any questions, something else I can answer.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. I think actually that brief overview was sufficient.
Okay. Allison. You're muted. Allison, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I wanted to just acknowledge some officers, and unfortunately didn't get their name, who were doing as our officers regularly do, whatever is asked or needed of them that's appropriate. At the time that the water came back on, I was walking in my neighborhood, and Congregation Beth Israel, which happens to be my temple, had an alarm go off, and they had a water main break, and they were trying to turn the water off. And some officers were there, and it was, some really strong and persistent officer that ultimately was able to turn the water off and save the destruction of the temple from the water leak that had just appeared. And they were very gracious about it. And I'm sure it's just one of many examples of our officers doing odd things during the storm and in their daily work. So I just wanted to thank them since I didn't get their names and acknowledge their assistance.
Well, thank you, Councilmember Alter. I appreciate you mentioning that. And much like our counterparts at Fire and EMS, we were challenged, but I feel like we really rose to the challenge. and our officers, without complaint, did the very best they could under those extremely challenging conditions. So thank you for mentioning that.
Colleagues? All right, those are all our topics. Kathy?
I'm sorry to ask this question, but I'm still confused about why. Thank you, by the way, Chief Chacon, for the overview and also for all of the work that your officers did. And thank you to both AFD and APD for really highlighting the role of fleet. I think that's not a story that has been told really, and so thanks to those what sound like the efforts that really helped so many other departments continue to function. Mayor, we haven't heard from EMS yet. I just wanted to remind you of that. I know we're at our time. And if we don't have time to address it here, maybe this could be in the Q&A, but I'm still confused about what happened with the chains? Like why were they insufficient? Was it that the conditions were just so much more intense than the chains we had available? And so again, if it's too complicated to go into here, maybe we can hear about it in the after action report. But those are some of the questions that I'm continue to linger.
And Councilmember, this is Brandon. I can answer it really quick. For us, the chains have traditionally worked very well. It was the duration of how long we had to keep them on is when we saw ours start to break, in which we had to do repairs. So more of the duration of it instead of just a one night issue.
Gotcha. Thank you.
All right, let's go to Chief. I'll let you finish that answer to that question, but I also want to get to EMS and Chief Rodriguez.
I was just going to say it was much of the same for us. The duration and just the number of chains that we had, we were unprepared for the length of the event.
Okay. Let's hear from EMS.
Council, this is Ernesto Rodriguez, Chief of EMS. I'm going to give a real brief overview, and then I'm going to turn over to Chief Brown for a little bit more detail. First, I'd like to recognize the incredible staff at the EMS department because they did some superhuman lifting during this event, and that same is true for all of the other employees of the city who pitched in and worked in areas doing things they don't normally do to get us through this. Some of the significant things that happened with EMS is our volume of calls increased by 4 times. Normally, we run about 400 calls in a day. We were hitting 1,600 during the winter storm, which is pretty significant for us. That's a huge leap in volume. We had a lot of trouble with our personnel getting to work because they couldn't travel in the storm and the ice and the snow. We had the loss of electricity was a big issue for many of the residents of our community because many of them are dependent on medical equipment and they struggle to maintain their health and their well-being if they can't operate their equipment that provides oxygen and other medical care for them. The loss of heat that we experienced caused people to defer to other unsafe methods to create heat. Like bringing in grills and burning and stuff that increased carbon monoxide exposures. And then there was the loss of food, and community couldn't get food because of the closure of the stores and all of that we've talked about. The same was true for our first responders. We had a really difficult time finding food for everyone. I think some of the most significant thing was the loss of infrastructure that we experienced, the loss of natural gas, electricity, food, water, medications, warmth, mobility, all those things that we rely on every day to make our lives go smoothly. I think most people in the community and first responders included, we can manage the loss of 1 or 2 of those things for a little while, but we sustain long periods of loss of most of that infrastructure for a long period, which caused a lot of problems with people trying to get help when they needed it. I'm going to turn over to Chief Brown at this point and let him talk a little bit about some of the things that we did in preparation and some of the things that we did during the event to try to manage everything. Chief Brown, are you on?
I am. Thank you, Chief. Josh Brown, Chief of Staff, Austin Travis County EMS. Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem, Council. Before the storm, we deployed our 4x4 units that we have available. We have several administrative vehicles that are 4x4 capable. We deployed them throughout the area so that we could respond to emergencies that our ambulance would not be able to respond to. As the storm progressed, we actually, as the chief mentioned, started seeing a large increase in call volume, and it wasn't traditionally as we've seen in previous storms of just slips, falls, traffic accidents, and things like that. We were actually seeing very sick patients as time went on due to the lack of dialysis or even the methadone clinics being closed. We were pressed into service to provide some medications that could bridge some people over from their missing dialysis, or even personnel that were suffering withdrawals with some buprenorphine. So we did some very unusual things to help those that were most in need. I would echo Chief Rodriguez's comments that our staff did an amazing, if not spectacular job with everything we could give them. We're doing an after-action report to see what we did good and what we did bad and where we could improve in the future. We've gotten feedback from our internal staff, our supervisory command staff. We've worked with Office of the Chief Medical Officer, and we'll put together an after-action report and begin to see what we can do in the future to make sure that we are better prepared.
Thank you. Colleagues. Allison?
This isn't specific for EMS, so if someone else has a question for EMS.
Mayor Pro Tem?
Raise your hand.
I don't recall raising my hand.
Okay. Chiefs, to all three of you, please convey the appreciation of the city to the ranks. It just seems like you guys were everywhere during that period of time. And I know that everybody got stressed, you guys, as much, if not more, as anybody else being on the front line. So thank you, and please thank them for us. Allison?
Thank you. I also want to add my thanks to all of your units and all the staff in the city who helped us navigate this storm. I don't know, and maybe this is covered somewhere, Councilmember Tova, but I had a question on the finances and FEMA and how that was working, because obviously if we have all of these units 24/7, extra overtime and all of that, which was absolutely necessary, that is a potential big financial hit. And I just would like to better understand how this is approached with respect to FEMA and reimbursements.
That's a good question. We have Juan with us.
That's an excellent question. To date, we only have Category B, which is emergency protective measures, as an eligible item through FEMA. And to date, we have about $1.8 million in expenses that we're working with FEMA to process, and that would be reimbursed at 75%. In addition to that, there are an additional about $7.1 million in other categories of damages that include debris removal, building and equipment, utilities, and parks and recreation facilities. That we provided that information to the state, and the state is working with FEMA and in hopes that those additional categories become eligible to the state of Texas and then eligible to the city of Austin as well. So we're still working through that process, through that recovery process. But only to date, right now, what we have eligible is about $1.8 million, like I said, at 75% reimbursed.
Thank you. And if you can just keep us posted as we learn more about that, and if there's anything that we can do in support, talking with our delegation, etc., please let us know.
Sure will. Thank you.
Thank you. Manager, do you want to have any concluding remarks of any kind? We're down to the last few minutes.
Just thank you, Mayor and Council. I mean, this is a critical conversation for our community about how we take a historic event like Winter Storm Uri and make sure that we are doing everything we can to take lessons from it and respond better in the future. We know that there were unique circumstances that existed here, but that doesn't mean that we can't be more resilient in how we approach more events, because we do know that we'll be seeing more in our future. So I just really appreciate the discussion and dialogue today. A lot of these comments will be incorporated into our after action reports. We are setting up a Q&A opportunity, much like we do with our regular council meetings. And so working through Katie to set up that Q&A process so we can make sure that we're responding with anything that hasn't been discussed today for the future. And then as you mentioned, Mayor, setting up a web page where all this can be consolidated into one access point for the public. So thanks again for the discussion. I'll just end on the acknowledgement and appreciation of all the staff, our community, and the leadership of the council. I mean, each of you played such a significant role in supporting our team and supporting our community through this event. And hopefully we won't go through something like this, but we know we will go through something significant in the future, and we will get through it together, and we will be stronger as a result. Thank you, Mayor.
Okay. Colleagues, anything else? Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you. The one last thing that I was thinking was something along the lines of a PSA to talk about some of those things that we discussed that, you know, people should just know how to do, you know, a real comprehensive campaign, you know, stop, drop, and roll, click it or ticket, you know, those kinds of things that people just never forget. You just do it out of force of habit. I just wonder what that'll look like on our end. Around things like, you know, not bringing grills inside because of carbon monoxide risk. You know, everybody in our community should just know you cannot do that under any circumstances. You'll make yourself sick. You could, you know, die if you do this. And so I wonder what that'll look like for us as we move forward.
Okay. Anything else? Juan, thank you for being with us this entire meeting. Manager, thank you. The rest of the staff, Kathy?
Yeah, just a last reminder that people can sign up. Again, if we can encourage community members, organizations, or volunteers to come speak at those community task forces meetings, I think that will really be a valuable piece of this ongoing conversation. So thanks to all of you.
Thank you. And then last, colleagues, we're going to go to the Q&A board with other things that you want to make sure the manager includes in the after action. With that, at 11:31, the special called meeting is adjourned. We gather back together next for our work session next week. See you guys then.
Don't you come in.